Twin Tales Publishing presents Prison Days, Recruitment by Simon King, narrated by Todd Waites. For Adele, one of the brave who made it through to the other side, thank you for your service. Chapter 1. Throughout the Prison Days series, I've often mentioned new recruits coming through and how they're so easily identified from other, more seasoned officers. There's a certain sense of freshness about them, an air of innocence one might liken to a newly born child. The day I first stepped into a maximum security prison, my eyes felt as wide as saucers, with my own nerves close to rupturing thanks to a myriad of Hollywood movies and endless documentaries. What I had expected to find that fateful day was definitely not what ended up waiting for me. With the initial turnover of shifts, just the start of a journey I would come to recollect time and time again. When I go back even further, to the time when I first came across the advert which would ultimately lead me down the path to working in such a place, I remember a sequence of events that felt more like fate than randomness. A number of events had somehow pre-wired me to what lay ahead, without me having the slightest clue of what my future path held for me. I truly believe these events came together to lead me through to maximum security. For you, it might happen in a similar way, with a number of seemingly unrelated moments opening your mind to the possibilities of working inside. Or it might just happen to be these very books that give rise to the possibility of you putting on the uniform and suddenly finding yourself inside. If they do, please let me know. I'd love to keep in touch and hear about your own journey sometime. Whichever way it happens, I want you to know that I understand how you feel, as do hundreds and even thousands of others who all put on a similar uniform each and every day and go to work in a place that society would rather try and forget ever actually existed. What you will find behind those walls will not only open your eyes to things you might have only ever suspected, but also show you a side of life that you might quickly wish you'd never seen at all. During the next few chapters, I want to share some of the expectations you might have about the place, as well as the types of things you may not learn during your initial training. Remember, every prison is different in certain ways, and yet they all share one undeniable commonality. They all contain crooks. If there's one bit of advice I can give you right off the bat, it's this. Nothing matters more than you going home safe to your family at the end of every single shift. Nothing. The dangers facing you number in the hundreds, make no mistake about it. Every single inmate poses a risk to you, as well as, sadly, some officers. They may not have any intention of causing you harm directly, but the reality is that some people aren't quite cut out for this kind of role, and through their actions, they may create a situation you can't avoid. Watch out for them. That's probably the best way to deal with them, by knowing they exist and identifying them early on. Prison Days Recruitment is more than just another Prison Days book, as far as I'm concerned. It's my little piece of advice I wish someone had handed me before I ever stepped inside a jail, to open my eyes to the expectations and what I might find once I'm on the inside. Knowing what I know now, I don't think it would have changed my decision to work inside, but I do believe I could have handled those first few weeks much better. There will come a time early on in your career when you will find a situation that might not seem quite right, maybe shocking you in a way you could never have expected. For me, it came in the form of a simple code, called during one of my first night shifts. It wasn't the blood from that moment, the massive pool filling almost the entire floor of the cell from wall to wall. It wasn't even the smell, the thick, rancid stench of coppery sickness. No, for me, The shock came from the inmate himself, the calmness with which he conducted himself. Half his calf muscle hung from the bone, sliced open with a plastic knife and a sliver of razor blade. The crook sat on his bunk as the nurses fought to stem the bleeding. The guy watched them work as if they were on his television screen. All he needed was a bowl of popcorn and a cold beer, and he would have been right at home, watching them save his leg and perhaps his life. The vision from that night didn't make sense to me, not in the way you might imagine. Why wasn't he screaming in pain or panicked? The amount of blood should have rendered him unconscious, and yet there he was, wide awake and occasionally grinning at those of us watching on. The smell, that god-awful stink, should have sent normal people reeling, and yet it didn't. Most of the other officers appearing as if it was nothing more than bad body odor. How can rational people stand idly by while the gruesome display continues on right before our eyes? I tried my hardest to hide my own revulsion, but will never forget how easily the others wrote it out. Then there was the raw brutality of the scene itself, a graphic horror show nobody should ever have to see, and yet we did. And not just once or twice, but at regular intervals. What that night taught me was one undeniable truth. The job would change me. Maybe not all at once, but gradually over time. We would all eventually come to see violence and all its depravity in a way that would no longer shock us the way it might have before we ever stepped into this place. I once heard another officer describe it as numbing us to the horror, and it truly does. What I might have flinched at in the beginning no longer affects me. I've dedicated an entire chapter to this phenomenon, just to make sure you understand your own journey once you take the first step. Think you know yourself now? Revisit that same question 6 months into your career and compare answers. During the next few chapters, I want to try and open your eyes in a way the previous books never could, by highlighting things you might never have thought about before thinking of joining the ranks. You might also find things you didn't pick up in the previous chapters of the series. While I personally performed a number of different jobs inside, there are so many more I may never have mentioned, duties that only a select few will ever have the pleasure of performing. There are also the various kinds of people you come into contact with, the characters, as well as those who need to be handled in vastly different ways. The one thing I do hope this book will bring you is the answers to the questions you might have when you first start the job. For me, walking into a fully unlocked unit for the first time and finding myself virtually surrounded by dangerous inmates is something hard to forget. The scariest part was seeing faces I recognized from newspaper articles and 6 o'clock news bulletins. Faces who had committed some of the most violent and vile attacks on innocent victims. That kind of shit hits harder than caffeine ever could. But prison isn't just about violence or inmates with horrific histories. It's also about the positives, like the friendships you build with other officers. You might even build a certain bond with a crook or two, although that's another chapter entirely and one I address further along. There's definitely a very fine line between professionalism and the other side of that line in the sand, one I have personally seen crossed many times and never ending well for the officer. As I said, this book is what I wish someone would have handed me at the very beginning of my career. It could have saved me from countless situations, some of which have never made it into the series. Humans are funny creatures. Some just happen to enjoy seeing others suffer. And I'm not talking about bloodthirsty serial killers. I've seen plenty of officers take the piss out of newbie recruits for a laugh, or just make them squirm a little. Hopefully, I can help you avoid some of these situations by sharing a few with you. If you ever do find yourself on the inside, as either a guard or an inmate, I want you to understand that the rules change the second you step through the front gate. Whatever preconceived ideas you have of the place need to fade away quickly. I found that even some of the documentaries I watched before my own time inside weren't always accurate, sometimes bending the truth for the sake of ratings. The best advice is simple: shut the hell up and don't highlight yourself. You'll learn so much more by watching from the sidelines, finding the right role models, and then listening to their advice. The best advice mightn't even come from a single person. Perhaps you'll listen to several officers and accept a little bit from each of them. It won't take you very long to know who the right ones are. I've seen more than a few officers enter the prison, their shirts a couple of sizes too small to highlight their muscles, walk around like they own the joint. It rarely takes long for reality to come calling, usually ending with a few missing teeth and a couple of wounded egos. For some of these crooks, we are their entertainment, and they don't really care how they use us for such. Try to keep that in mind when sitting inside a unit surrounded by a few dozen of them, all looking for something to fill their day. And now, without further ado, let's tighten our seatbelts and get this train underway. I've prepared more eye-opening chapters for you to experience. There's fun to be had, places to see, and above all, some prisons to visit. Chapter 2. One of the scariest moments in my entire career wasn't some heart-stopping, blood-splattering confrontation with a dozen crooks down a dark hallway. It didn't even feature crooks at all. And the weird part is that at that precise point in time where said scary moment took place, I had never laid eyes on a single one of them. For me, one of the biggest obstacles to starting this career was, well, me. My brain. My preconceived ideas, conjured up from countless hours of prison documentaries, Hollywood movies, and locally produced prison dramas. It came from things I had seen on TV or the internet, stories I'd read in newspapers and books. And the funny thing is, none of it proved right, or at least in my situation. The scariest moment for me, hands down, was the drive to the prison for an information night. An hour-long session designed to not only give the prison recruiters a chance to speak to prospective recruits, but also give us, as those prospective recruits, a chance to check out the other side of the walls, which for me, I had never laid eyes on. Prison was as much a mystery to me as the dark side of the moon. I had no clue as what to expect. Sure, I had those preconceived ideas, but when one gets right down to it, we all know what we see on TV is always going to be different from how things actually play out. For you, I'm guessing it will be much the same. It's not going to matter whether you apply for a job in the toughest hood in Chicago, USA, or the quiet backwaters of rural Victoria, Australia. At some point, you will most likely be offered an opportunity to see what it's all about, and invited in for a similar session. I can't see a prison going through the motions of taking on recruits without giving you at least some sort of taste of what to expect. The drive. That's what scared me the most. Coming over that final rise and seeing the walls in the distance felt like I had officially crossed the proverbial tracks from my sheltered life to the harsh reality of maximum security. My insides felt like a hot piece of lead had been dropped inside, my butthole puckering at the thought of me walking through to the other side. Most prisons have just two entrances, the one for the deliveries and the one for everybody else. Having just two makes controlling the way in much more feasible. Just imagine the amount of people wanting to get gear inside. And I'm not talking about the latest Jack Reacher novel, but more on that later. When I finally managed to pull myself together, and found the courage to step out of my vehicle, I walked to the second option, the only door open for visitors and staff alike. When I think back to that walk, it felt like at least 1,000 steps long, with me nervously looking around for signs of others in my situation. It is a walk made by every single person you will find working inside. Everybody had their first experience of walking into prison. What happens next will depend on your choice of prison, as well as the location. Reception areas vary around the world, and many will have different rules. For mine, you had to be cleared for access in advance, which means you can't just roll up and expect to be let inside. Once called to the counter, you hand over your driver's license and they confirm your appointment. It pays to do a bit of research yourself on this topic. Maybe find prisons in your local area that are recruiting and see what procedures they follow. If nobody appears to be recruiting, I can almost guarantee that they will soon. Staff turnover in this industry is high, to say the least. It's high for a very good reason, or a bad one, depending on which way you look at it. Once inside, my advice is to try and remove the curiosity side of the visit and really open your eyes. If you can, it also helps to try and talk to any current serving officers, so if the opportunity arises, grab it with both hands. The opportunity, not the officer. By the way, you might have noticed that I call those who work in the prison officers. Some places still call them guards, and while it might not sound any different, it actually is. Prison guards are what we used to be called years ago, but that's changed. Correctional officers is the proper term, and I found more than a few of my colleagues get upset if a crook calls them a guard, so just a heads up for you. Officers can be a touchy lot. It just depends on their mood on any given day. Remember, this isn't a job considered a walk in the park, and I don't recall too many shifts where something significant didn't go down. Even some of the quietest days spent inside still had one or two incidents to report. For many people inside the prison, the staff to them are family, and while an incident might have happened in another part of the jail, you will probably find that they know those people involved and know them well. Once you understand how quickly moods can change in this environment, you'll find the emotional minefield much easier to navigate through. Don't be afraid to ask questions of those you come across during your introductory visit, but understand that the tone may not always be welcoming as you might expect. The other advice I think that is important to give is that when you do listen to other officers describe the role to you, perhaps as they share a war story or two and take you on a tour of some of the units where you might work, is to pay attention. I don't mean to them, although definitely listen to what they have to say. What I mean is to look at things objectively. Very objectively. Prison isn't a cakewalk. Not for officers and not for the crooks. Despite how staunch a lot of them might come across, believe me when I say that for many, the nerves don't lie far beneath that rugged outer shell. I've seen too many people take on the job and barely last their first week. They come in all glitzy-eyed, envisioning some movie role existence as they change the lives of countless prisoners. Glamour, prestige. It all quickly fades when they finally walk through an unlocked unit and find themselves face to face with hardened criminals who wouldn't think twice about ripping out your eyeballs. The other thing I've seen are too many guys thinking they have the Schwarzenegger appearance, strolling around with their arms wide and believing themselves tough enough to take on anybody. Maybe they are capable, maybe not. But while they might be sizing inmates up for a bit of a toe-to-toe, they forget that nothing is ever fair in this place. They'll soon find themselves tested with one or two of the smaller blokes, while others stand back and watch from a distance. If that new officer does put on a bit of a show, he'll quickly get put back in his place when half a dozen crooks come for him all at once. Remember that muscles in this place don't mean squat. What I highly advise is to walk into your introductory tour with realistic expectations. Glamour may seem attractive when you tell others about this role, but they're not the ones walking in here. You are. Ask yourself some honest questions, because if you don't, you are definitely not the only one who will suffer because of it. While it might seem okay just to give things a go and walk out if you feel you're not right for the job, the reality is there are probably multiple ramifications from your decision. The first is perhaps the most frustrating one in that the position you took up could have gone to someone more suitable. Perhaps there was something a recruiter saw in you that trumped others, giving you the edge over the competition, when in reality, you didn't take things seriously, while they perhaps would have. It leaves a gap in the recruiting numbers, meaning fewer able-bodied people to fill rosters. While the first may have only been more of an inconvenience, the second one is far more serious. Other staff will depend on you with their lives, and I don't say that lighthearted. I've seen what happens when a unit kicks off and only 2 of the 3 staff on duty back each other. I've witnessed the damage, the injuries, the permanent scars that never heal. So, for fuck's sake, if you're going to consider a role as a correctional officer, know what you're up against and ask yourself the all-important questions. Are you capable? Are you willing? Do you have the mental strength? Do you have the confidence? And, of course, the all-important one, do you have the balls? If you don't think you have, then perhaps look at either developing those skills, speak with someone before accepting the job so that you can try and get some advice, or maybe just consider another role entirely. Okay, now that we've gotten that out of the way, let me share some of the details about my own training. Just before I do, I might share the application process in a little more detail. This process is one determined mainly by which prison you apply for, and might vary in several ways, but I'd assume it's fairly similar to my own. Once through the introductory tour, you'll most likely be handed some sort of information pack containing all the details needed to apply for a position within the facility. For me, it contained a couple of booklets as well as a website through which to apply. The next part of the application process is pretty standard stuff. It requires you to throw down all the usual information needed in order for them to understand who you are, where you come from, and what your background is. Once finished and submitted, the waiting begins. How long you wait really depends on the place itself. Some prisons conduct multiple intakes per year, while others just one. The next stage may take days, weeks, or even months to go through, and you have no choice but to wait. One day, you'll be sitting in your living room or at work, and an email arrives advising you that your application has either been declined or that you've progressed through to the next stage. The next steps may play out in a different order, but they usually go something like this. First is a background check, followed by a doctor's checkup. Here, you'll need to submit to a urine test, hearing test, and general health check. Next, you'll need to attend a police station and submit your fingerprints. Again, this is totally dependent on where you apply. For me, it was only after I passed each of these steps that I finally got invited in for a face-to-face interview, one where 3 people interviewed me at once. The one thing I will point out here is that you do need to take this part seriously. While there for my interview, I saw and heard of people turning up in singlets, flip-flops, stinking of body odor. It's a professional interview, and as such, needs to be treated as one. I still didn't find out I was successful until some time later, so be aware the waiting may continue for a little longer. Once you do, though, congratulations. It's time to get into the classroom and train your ass in all things prisons. For you, this will vary from a little to a lot depending on where you choose to join. Countries, states, individual cities, government-run prisons, and jails run by private corporations. They all employ different rules, strategies, and training regimes. Your location will determine the exact type of training course you undertake for yourself. Through these books, I've interacted with a lot of current and retired officers, and I don't think I've ever come across two who shared the same training regime when first starting the job. When I first walked into the prison that fateful first morning as an official trainee correctional officer, the nerves felt unlike anything before them. The information night had been one thing, but turning up for the first official day of training was quite another. The group walked in that morning looking wide-eyed and out of place. The feeling of being the new kid in school definitely hung heavy on a lot of my classmates. Well, all except a couple of them, one of whom I cover in another chapter. This is the point in time where I want you to remind yourself of something important, especially if you're considering one of the more specific units at the end of your training. During the next however many weeks and months, your trainers will not only be assessing you through endless tests and presentations, but also during your downtime, those bathroom breaks, and meal times when you mingle with your fellow classmates. You will be watched every minute of every day and assessed for specific positions around the prison. I didn't find this out until the very last day, when our trainers handed each of us our initial allocations. One of them made the point as he held out my slip of paper, and I looked to find I'd been given the admissions area along with one other in the class. The thing to remember here is that it's not any one thing they're looking for. Nobody will ever possess all the skills needed to work in every part of the prison. Nobody. Some will be introverts, others extroverts. Some will have brawn over brain, others flipping them around. Some will possess that ability to listen without constantly shooting their mouth off, while others just want to get chatting. Whatever your personality or individual skill set, just be aware that your trainers will be watching you from afar and taking notes. This is an assessment that runs for a lot longer than those various written tests you take toward the end of your course. Speaking of the course itself, prepare for some pretty hectic days of endless presentations and note-taking. There is a lot, and I mean a lot of information to cram into that brain of yours, and once your trainers have signed off on you knowing it, guess who becomes the one responsible for upholding it? What do I mean by that? Throughout my course, our trainers constantly ran days where we would complete endless tests on specific subjects, confrontations, and the legalities surrounding the use of force, operational requirements of a unit, legal requirements of holding inmates in management units. These are just a few examples of the types of information you'll be learning. Each time we finished learning a certain section, we'd be tested on it, officially. There'd be written tests with perhaps 20 to 30 questions, and you didn't get a pass until you got every question right. The trainers would check them there and then, and if you got any wrong, you had to go back and repeat those questions until you got them right. And then you signed those tests, not once, not twice, but 3 times, each and every one of them. One signature on the front to confirm you had received the test alongside what written rules you needed to apply, and one on the back to confirm you had completed the test alone and according to the aforementioned rules. The third signature was to acknowledge that you knew the information taught to you, and that you could now comfortably use that knowledge to work inside the prison. I heard one of the trainers whisper to one of the others that only that final signature was the one the company cared about the most. That last one, the signature they sealed away and kept for a rainy day. Or the day you screwed up enough to warrant either disciplinary action or maybe even a court hearing. That final signature was what the company used to clear themselves and leave you holding the bag of shit, the one you'd need to carry around and deal with. This isn't to be critical of their procedures, but for me personally, I found the course rushed. A lot of the units plowed through so quickly that barely any of the information sank in. When questioned about the pace, we were told that a lot of what we really needed to know would come to us through the course of our duties. All I'm saying on this is for you to be aware going in. Pay attention, because it might come back to haunt you later on. On top of all the academic studies you need to get through, there will also be 3 or 4 other units involving a more hands-on kind of approach. These can be fun, challenging, and also quite eye-opening. But be aware that you need to pass all of them in order to get through to the other side. These other sections include firefighting, TAC ops, or hand-to-hand defensive techniques, shadowing, role-playing, and first aid training. Your prison may have other bits and pieces, but these were the ones I went through. For many, shadowing will be the very first taste of unit life, and believe me when I tell you, it's eye-opening. There is nothing that can prepare you for this moment, and my only suggestion is to try and not look so much like a fish out of water. The crooks will know that you're a new officer, so just go along with it. Be new. Being new is a definite benefit, and you can use that as an excuse for weeks to come. I've known officers who use that excuse for months after they began. One of the biggest benefits of shadowing is that you get to experience various units around the prison during these limited stints. For me, we did 4 separate shadow shifts, each one in a different area, which gave me quite a good look at how things worked. Funnily enough, none of these shifts ended up being in the place where I eventually ended up. Do I think training prepared me for what I faced out in the prison? Personally, no. Aside from our trainer, we also had a squad leader who had worked throughout the prison during his 20-year career. He gave us plenty of war stories and advice about what to expect, but his favorite quote was, "You'll find out for yourself once you're out there." He was right, of course. The majority of what you need to know, you won't pick up until you're out walking the floor yourself, and once your training is over, that is exactly where you end up. Chapter 3. The people you go through your training with will be the faces you recognize the most during your time inside, and it won't matter how much time passes between sightings. The only similarity I can compare it to is perhaps the relationships people build during military recruit schools. You know the kinds I'm talking about, the friendships almost close enough to be called family. The people I went through those first few weeks of training with are probably the only ones I still keep in touch with now. The thing is, not everybody will fit that bill. You see, there's a certain number of people who will take a very different path through their career than your own, and sometimes those paths may not be on the right side of the law. During my training days, various numbers were thrown at us from both trainers and leaders alike. Averages that explained the odds of who we might be sitting amongst. One of those numbers? The chance that 1.4 people in each and every new intake would cross the line with a crook, meaning they would have a relationship with an inmate. I still remember that number was thrown out to us and how we took a look around the room, peering into the eyes of those surrounding us to see who it might be. That particular number only took in the females in the class, and while gay relationships did also happen from time to time, this story isn't about one of those. Given we only had 4 or 5 women in our class, we didn't think it possible. Boy, how wrong we were. And who it ended up being wasn't someone I would have ever suspected. Have you ever known someone who just thought themselves so much more superior than everyone else? The funny thing is that during my time in that course, I never had much to do with this woman. I've spoken about her briefly in Book 6, Gail Humphreys. So, Gail and I never really mingled during the course of the training. She always sat in the very front row of the class, and I was always in the second from the back row. Or was I in the back? I don't think it matters. Those she hung out with during breaks weren't the people I hung out with during breaks, so I didn't really pay much attention. What I didn't know, and wouldn't find out for a few years after we graduated, was that Gail didn't really hang out with anybody during breaks. She was too good for even that. Where she would go was to the regular staff room to hang with those employed in the admin building. The thing about Gail worth mentioning is the fact she wasn't new to the prison. For one, she had worked in one of the adjoining departments outside of the prison for some time, and through this, knew quite a few people inside. However, it was probably because her husband also happened to be one of the prison's supervisors who helped her get a spot on our course. Married with 3 teenage children, that was Gail. Like I said, our paths didn't even cross, and once we graduated, I don't think I ever saw her during the course of the following years. Maybe we passed each other down some corridor, but that was about as far as things went. Actually, now that I think of it, I do remember our paths crossing during one specific time, and it was a chance meeting that left a pretty sour taste in my mouth. I waved to her as we both reached a gate, her on one side and me on the other. I remember saying hello to her and opening the gate. Not only did she completely ignore my greeting, but she didn't even thank me for opening the gate for her. It was when I mentioned the incident to a friend of mine a couple of days later that I found out things I had been completely oblivious to, including how she used to think of herself as so much better than everyone else during the course. I'd come in for a night shift, from memory, and this friend, who was also on our course, also happened to be on. I think it was during an escort that I told her about said incident, and that was when she shared some very interesting information. "You've heard about her, right?" this friend asked me. "Heard about her? No, why?" "She's been charged." Charged? I honestly couldn't get my head around it. Gail Humphreys charged? This was a woman who I'd always assumed walked a fairly straight line. One thing I did know about her was just how much she hated crooks. Not just a little bit, but almost obsessively. The way she spoke either about them or to them, it didn't matter. Her feelings were fairly clear. She had several charges made against her, including the ongoing bullying of other staff, smuggling contraband into the prison, possession of contraband, plus the big one, having inappropriate relations with an inmate. All I could do was stare in disbelief at the idea that not only one of our own, but someone so well connected to the prison staff would willfully betray the very foundation of the job. "She fucked us," was all I could say. "Well, she certainly fucked someone," my friend said, and she was right. Gail Humphreys had applied for a soups gig before anybody else in our class, and that included the one person who probably deserved it more than anybody. But I'll get to that in another chapter. She was neither ready for that kind of role, nor did she have the demeanor for it, and yet she had the position handed to her. For the next few months, this woman went from one confrontation to another, and I'm not talking about just inmates. The number of staff she rubbed up the wrong way could have filled the unit themselves. The moment I found out about her charges, I started hearing so much more about her during my shifts, like how nobody actually liked her on our course. Apparently, Most of those whom I assumed to be her friends were anything but. Most couldn't stand her and gladly avoided her the moment we graduated. I think for me, the worst part of all of this was her husband, a supervisor who still worked in the prison. He wasn't one of the most popular ones either, not by a long way, but he was still part of our crew. Feelings aside, his was a name now mud, the butt of people's jokes, and I'm not just talking about staff. It was the inmates who unleashed the hardest, and it didn't come as a surprise when I heard that he had taken a month's leave to deal with the situation. Can you imagine it? Part of a committed relationship, a family, if you will. And here he had his entire life turned upside down thanks to a wife who had relations with an inmate. I can't even begin to understand what he must have gone through, or their children for that matter. I think I must have heard the jokes doing the rounds for weeks before they began to show signs of dying down. The rumors weren't much better, with some suggesting that the relationship between officer and inmate had gone on for months. As a supervisor, she managed to gain access to the unit after hours, although it was during unlocked hours when the majority of their meetings took place. One of the biggest surprises for me when I heard the crook she'd been screwing behind everybody's back. It wasn't a name any of us had been expecting, a name all of us knew for one specific reason. Part of a certain gang. It was a surname carried by perhaps half a dozen inmates, all currently serving time in various parts of the prison. It was also a name associated with a certain race of people, the kind this woman had also openly insulted on multiple occasions. None of it made sense, and yet she never once tried to deny it. Footage confirmed the accusations, and she eventually faced her charges in the main office with the jail's hierarchy. 2 of the 4 charges ended up dropped, but the other 2 remained, one being the inappropriate relationship. Gail Humphreys was fired from her job and walked off the site the very same day she met with the prison's top brass. Good riddance, I say. Her husband eventually returned. I say eventually because it did take some 3 to 4 months for me to see him for the first time. What surprised me most was that he still wore his wedding ring. Of course, that only sent the gossips into a fresh frenzy, and before long, multiple rumors spread. Did I believe? To tell you the truth, I didn't care. I didn't like him before the mess. I didn't like him after. I did feel sorry for him, though. Nobody deserves that kind of betrayal. Nobody. So, why am I telling you all this? Because I want you to know before you go in that you won't always know the people sitting around you. Those who you might see as straight-laced may just be the exception to the rule. Know that not everybody will be playing by the rules. I've seen plenty of staff cave into the pressures associated with this job, and yes, some of them even ended up behind the walls themselves. Don't be one of them. Chapter 4. Gail Humphreys is just one story in many I could share with you, highlighting the kind of deception you might encounter throughout your own journey. And while I know plenty of similar stories, there are also those far more severe when it comes to betraying the trust of fellow staff. This chapter is about what happens once you finally graduate from your intake class and the kinds of people you may encounter during your first few weeks walking the floor. Most of the staff I encountered were good people. They still are. I just want to make that clear before I begin to talk about the other kind, the ones you might find yourself trying to steer clear from during certain shifts. Many of the staff I worked with wanted nothing more than to do their job to the best of their ability and go home safely at the end of each shift. And just let me highlight that point a second time. The most important part of any shift is the part where you go home safe at the end of it. Nothing in that place is worth your safety. Not yours, and certainly not that of your family. And yes, There can be certain instances where you could put your family's safety in jeopardy if you don't pay attention. Keep listening to find out how. Do you want to know what prison is all about? When you get right down to brass tacks, prison is about nothing more than people. People are what make the place. People are what define the place. Without people, prison is nothing more than a bunch of walls with no purpose. It's the people who give the place its purpose. The kinds of people you will come across will vary in character and demeanor so much that you may lose track of the things you need to be keeping an eye out for. Here are a few types of staff I came in contact with during my time inside. First, there are those in it for the same reason as you, coming into work each day to finish their shift so they can return home at the end of it. They get their heads down and do what needs doing without too much griping, happy to hold up their end just as long as everyone else does too. Unfortunately, that doesn't always go to plan. These were the people I like to hang with, to work alongside knowing we would get through the shift together. Next, I found the over-the-top staff, those just a little too keen to let inmates know who was in charge. They would be the ones running everything precisely by the book, not giving in no matter what. They would normally be the loudest in a group, walking with their arms wide and parading around like the owners of the place. These were also the ones I tried to keep my distance from, because time would not be on their side. Sooner or later, crooks grow tired of this kind of behavior, and that would be when the shit hits the fan. Sometimes, quite literally. I've seen buckets that had been passed from one cell to the next for every crook to take a shit in, and then see it end up thrown into the face of this kind of officer. Trust me when I say that you do not want to be standing near them when the turds start flying. The next type of person you might come across are the quiet ones, those who say very little throughout their shifts. Silence doesn't mean weakness, so don't assume that just because they're not constantly flapping their gums, they might be fearful of their surroundings. Some people just don't have a lot to say, and sometimes it can make a shift just a little more unbearable. It is what it is, and whether personal or general, just know that not everybody will go out of their way to be your friend. Another character trait you might come across is the complacent officer. I once read a meme that said complacency is a correctional officer's biggest enemy, and I agree with that wholeheartedly. Complacency is what gets people hurt in so many ways. For most who become complacent, it's just a matter of forgetting where they are. This is prison, maximum security prison. This is a place filled with prisoners who range from the timid to the extreme. Murderers, rapists, thieves, gang members, outlaw bikers, muscle-bound hotheads, drug addicts, drug dealers, psychos, and that's just a few of them. Throw in a few deadly diseases nobody warns you about, a few incredibly short fuses, and you get the idea of the kind of minefield you navigate each and every shift. Prison is a dangerous place, perhaps the most dangerous of all. And yet you will come across officers who've walked the halls so many times without incident that they consider the danger as nothing more than make-believe. I've seen them walk in front of inmates during escorts instead of behind them. I've seen them escort a dozen of them single-handedly to a unit after hours. I've heard them speak to prisoners like they're their best friends, hand them random pieces of uniform just because, let them take things to their cells that should never be allowed inside units, and all because they want to make themselves out to be some kind of superior officer. Complacency is not bothering to double-check a locked cell door and risking the life of a fellow staff member. One incident comes to mind here, one that sent goosebumps over my skin. I think I shared it before, but it's always worth another mention. A friend of mine worked a night shift inside a short-term management unit once, one holding around 50 inmates. Night shift officers came into units a few minutes before the final muster was called, and so would see the final few minutes of the day play out. Once all the inmates had been locked away again, and the cells locked, a couple of officers conducted the muster, with a third officer from an adjoining unit following close behind to double-check that the doors were indeed locked. One of the staff from that unit also ventured over to the other unit to check their doors and then sign off the task in the unit logbook. At around 10 p.m., the duty supervisor came through and conducted a quick check of the unit, a task repeated the following morning at around 3 a.m. My friend did what she had to during her shift, which mainly involved replenishing the supplies in the officer station. Other than that, it was either a good book or a TV for the rest of the night. Her only other duty during the course of the shift happened at around 6 a.m., when she would take a couple of crates filled with milk cartons and place one in front of each of their cells. Inmates receive 1 milk carton per day, hence the job for the night shift staff. Imagine her shock when she reached a cell on the top tier at the far end with the door handle still stuck in the unlocked position. No, not stuck, just not adjusted into the locked position. The cell door was essentially open, which meant the crook inside could have come out at any point during the night. We're talking about a lone woman in that unit. Yes, there is a single camera at one end that might have picked up an inmate venturing out after hours, but how likely is it that the control room officer also just happened to be staring at the monitor at that moment? They also had jobs to do, and monitoring cameras wasn't a full-time role. That situation could have ended badly, very badly. I shudder at the thought of what could have happened if that crook had taken advantage. Thankfully, he didn't, and nobody was hurt. Yes, she called for the supervisor to come and lock the cell up as unit night shift don't carry cell keys, and for a very good reason. 4 separate officers should have checked each and every one of those cell doors, but did they? Or were they each complacent enough to believe that someone else would do the job correctly and they themselves didn't need to? Like I said, I shuddered when she told me. Complacency is an officer's greatest enemy. Just remember that. Scared officers also exist, although these won't always be obvious. You can normally spot them when a crook or two begin going off tap, maybe prepping for a confrontation. These officers will generally find a reason to leave the building or choose that moment to hit the head for some bathroom needs. If you do spot one, just be aware that they may not always offer backup when needed, so be prepared for it ahead of time. Something else you'll want to prepare yourself for is the pranks officers like to play on one another. I've seen my fair share of them, and while some were certainly worthy of a laugh or two, many of them also came at the expense of newbies. I'm telling you this because there will be officers around who will take great pleasure in making you look like a complete twat simply for being new. I've seen it. I've experienced it. And it's not a great feeling, especially when those standing around enjoy the laugh at your expense just a little too much. Please don't let their actions deter you from asking questions. If you don't know something, then definitely ask, because personally, I'd rather be laughed at than make a mistake that could potentially cost someone their life. One person who comes to mind is an officer I worked with in one of the protection units. He was an old hand, in for the job for maybe a decade, and this particular day, I'd come in as a GD to help out while another officer had to head home for personal reasons. The third officer was relatively new, having graduated from their course just a week or so earlier. The moaning began the second this new officer headed to the bathroom. This guy told me how frustrating it was to work with someone so new and how little she knew about her job. "Then why don't you help her?" was what I said to him, and he turned to me and said it wasn't his job. He told me if they didn't teach recruits enough about the role, then they would find out the hard way. I used to teach people to drive, And one of the things I would often tell my students was the fact that most of what they needed to learn would come once they had their license and began driving alone. They would learn through experience. The same can be said for this job. Most of the things you need to know will come through the work itself and normally be shared with people you work next to. This guy's attitude isn't the norm, but just be aware that it does exist. To me, I don't see the point in being an asshole. Not when we need to work together as a team. And then, there's also the matter of backup. Wouldn't it make more sense to help bring someone up to speed before the shit hits the fan so you'll know they'll be ready to back you up? Why the fuck would you choose to be a dick about things and risk the both of you getting hurt? It still doesn't make sense to me thinking back to that day. Each to their own, I guess. When that officer returned from the bathroom, I did point out a few things to keep an eye on, as well as a few pointers when dealing with inmates through a trap. There are some lessons trainees tend to forget, and it doesn't take long to see which. The advice I was given when starting inside was to treat the inmates the way I wanted to be treated. Respect is a two-way street, sure, but that didn't mean I needed to bow down to them. Just carry yourself the way you normally would and give them everything they're entitled to. No more, no less. Something else to keep in mind is when you need to check on an inmate through a trap. That small trap door nestled into the middle of a cell door. It never ceases to amaze me the number of staff who stand directly in front of the trap when lowering it and then peering in through that narrow slit without any hesitation. Believe me when I tell you that if you decide to throw caution to the wind and blindly stare in through an open trap, then you will set yourself up for pain. Getting hot watered through a trap is not something I recommend, nor is having shit or piss thrown at you. Spit is another possibility, as is the pointy end of a pen, a sliver of razor blade, or even a dirty syringe. It may not sound real, but these are just some of the ways officers get hurt. Never, I repeat, never stand directly in front of a trap when you lower it. Stand to the side, slowly lower it, and maybe run the back of your hand in front of the open gap once the trap itself is lowered. Call out to the inmate, or inmates, and wait for them to respond. If the cell is dark, as most of them tend to be kept, then use your flashlight as a kind of barrier. Only when you're absolutely sure do you look through the gap. And think twice about doing so if you've had any sort of altercation with the inmate before. I've seen the trauma of an officer getting hot water thrown into their face. I've seen and smelled the sickening aftermath of a shit bomb flying through an open trap into the face of an unfortunate officer. These things can and do happen all the time. Don't be the one who ends up in hospital losing an eye because you've become complacent. Remember, complacency is your biggest enemy. And while we're on the subject of hints and tips, here are a few more I wanted to throw in for good measure. These are just a collection of things I tended to use to get me through each shift without unnecessary injuries. Maybe throw them into your own toolbox and use them as needed. Because of the constant danger this job entails, I found a way for me to always remind myself of the fact whenever I came in for a new shift. I used clocking on as the trigger for me to switch into work mode. From the moment I tapped my security pass onto the scanner, my work persona awoke and remained in place until I clocked off again, however many hours later. In a way, I guess it helped me push that complacency aside and let me focus on making it through the shift in one piece. The next tip is about searching, which you will undoubtedly be a part of. Prisoners hide stuff, that's a given. Be it drugs, weapons, alcohol, porn, medication, gang-related messages, or whatever else, it will be up to you and your colleagues to find the contraband. And prisoners tend to be outrageously good at hiding the stuff. For me, it always made sense for inmates to get their gear out of the cells during unlocked times in case we tipped their cell. random cell searches happened every day, but rarely did they happen after lockdown. We also didn't search common areas until after lockdown, which meant the crooks simply picked their shit up just before we locked them in for the night. You'd think this point would be obvious to the hierarchy, but for some reason, this was how the game played out each and every day. Things do still get found, so be aware that it's not always smooth sailing for inmates hiding stuff. Sometimes they screw up and we score a win. Cell searches still need to be conducted in a way where nothing is left untouched. Here are but a few of the places where they tend to hide things. Inside toothpaste tubes, inside margarine containers, inside milk cartons, inside empty eggshells and turned upside down in containers, inside books and magazines, inside mattresses and pillows, under the rim of the toilet bowl, suspended down the sink drain, dispersed amongst piles of clothes, hidden inside a frozen loaf of bread, inside bags of cereal, hidden inside rubbish bins and bags, all through refrigerators. Fridges are one of the most popular places to hide their gear, either on top, underneath, hidden in the motor section, or inside the rubber door seals. Whatever you do, do not run your fingers along these door seals. I've seen plenty of officers receive needle stick injuries because they ran their fingers down the length of the seals only for a syringe to be hidden inside. Just use the tip of your fingers and carefully squeeze the seals, slowly letting go and moving your hand along before repeating the process. A note on rubbish bins or trash cans. Get used to putting on some rubber gloves and emptying rubbish bags. You'd be surprised how much stuff we used to find hidden amongst old food scraps, empty containers, and balled-up tissues. If they think you won't look in a certain place, then that is where they'll choose to hide stuff. Another tip is for when you need to escort prisoners around the jail. Never walk ahead of them. Always remain behind them. Most of the time, they'll know where they need to go anyway, and will gladly take the lead. If a locked gate blocks the path, then wait for them to reach it and pause before unlocking it. Once they're through, they'll continue on until the next gate anyway. Walking in front of them opens you up to getting king hit from behind, and we all know how that ends for those on the receiving end of one. If you ever come across an incident kicking off or an officer getting assaulted, be sure to report the incident via radio first. Don't go running into battle before notifying the control room or somebody in the vicinity. If inmates overpower you and nobody knows of the incident, how is anybody going to help you? Oh, and if you happen to find two crooks going at it, don't intervene without backup, no matter how one-sided the fight is. Remember, this is about you going home safe at the end of your shift. I've seen footage of two crooks going at it and an officer interfering. Imagine his surprise when both crooks turned their anger onto him and both began assaulting him at once. Always report a fight and always wait for backup before doing anything else. Maybe the crooks aren't fighting, but instead baiting you with insults. Maybe they're calling your wife a slut or a whore or someone who they're going to visit when they get out. Do you wear a wedding band? Crooks pick up on that sort of stuff. Do you openly speak about your family, hobbies, or your home? Never mention where you live when around inmates. Prisoners are a crafty bunch, so be aware of the kind of information you're handing out to them. Your first few weeks and months on the floor will bring all sorts of tests from the crooks, so be ready for them. Insults are to see how you react. Remember, there's a fine line between showing weakness and refusing to be sucked into an argument. You'll face confrontations, inmates willingly doing the wrong thing to see if you pick them up for it. They'll soon figure you out. Ignore the insults, hold your personal information close to your chest, and always deal with unruly behavior. You might even find inmates asking you for special favors, maybe telling you a sob story or two. Perhaps they might ask you to bring in something innocent like chewing gum, which is illegal. Inmates tend to jam it into locks, and it creates all sorts of problems. Just be aware that once you agree to the small stuff, It won't be long before they elevate the request to more serious things. Don't do it. Just politely decline and change the subject. If they insist, tell them it would be in their best interest to let it go. The next bit of advice is to check and check again. Be it a locked cell door, a yard gate, a unit door, handing out a movement slip, or checking a crook's ID card. Whatever the case may be, check it once and then check it a second time to be sure. The last thing you want is to be the one responsible for causing someone's death through sheer complacency. Don't think it ends up in death? There was a case a few years ago where an officer handed out a movement slip to a crook who had just returned from court. Movement around our prison was determined through different colored movement slips, with certain units linked to specific colors. This particular officer was new, and when he asked one of his colleagues which colored slip he needed to issue for this particular unit, the other officer laughed and told him to figure it out. He ended up listening to the crook, probably the dumbest move of all. After filling out the slip, he handed it to the inmate and then let him out of the building. The gate to this particular unit happened to be manned by another newbie, and while the colored slip was correct, he didn't realize the crook wasn't assigned to that particular unit, and so let him through. It also happened to be in the middle of the day, and so half the unit was out in the yard enjoying the sunshine. The second the gate closed behind him, this crook scanned the yard, found his target, and ran at him. What followed was an ass-whooping of epic proportions, as this inmate unleashed on his co-accused who had flipped his evidence and made a deal. I'm talking fractured eye socket, busted lips, black eyes, broken nose, and all before any officers could intervene. This could have all been avoided if the original officer had simply checked on what he was handing out. If you don't know, then ask. If the first person is a dick about it, ask someone else. Ask until you get the right answer, and if you need to, phone a supervisor just to be sure. Yes, you might cop an earful about interrupting someone's day, but you might just save yourself a whole heap of shit in the long run. People, especially inmates, will try and pull the wool over your eyes. If they think they can get one over you, they will try, and that's guaranteed. Use your common sense. And in finishing, here's one final bit of advice. Don't be afraid to use a line I like to use during my own early months on the job. It came in handy plenty of times and summed things up perfectly. I might be new to the job, but I'm not new to the planet. Chapter 5. Continuing on from the previous chapter, there will be times when you will come across people who don't appear to have much life experience, acting as if they only just joined the human race and are unaware of a thing called society. These are the ones who walk through the jail completely oblivious to the consequences of their actions, leaving spot fires wherever they go for the rest of the team to deal with. Remember Tony Malone? I don't know whether I've gone over this part in previous books, but Tony went through intake training with me. One of my classmates. He sat a row or two ahead of me in that room, and even then used to do shit that left a lot of us shaking our heads. Imagine my utter disappointment when I walked into admissions during that very first shift on the floor, only to see him assigned to the very same place. Maybe disappointment isn't the right word, perhaps not strong enough to describe how I felt. This guy annoyed me on every level and scared me with the way he carried himself. I knew early on that he would cause issues that affected not just himself or the inmates he rubbed the wrong way, but also the unfortunate staff working alongside him. The only good thing to come out of our same placement was the fact we each served on different lines, which meant we only crossed paths twice a fortnight due to the rosters. 2 shifts still felt like way too much for me, but I knew it could have been worse. I think it took just 2 shifts for Tony to make a name for himself in that area, with him dubbed someone to watch by the duty soup. We both spent the first shift learning the processes of the place before spending the bulk of the afternoon doing strip searches. During the next shift, where he spent time doing his first few strip searches alone, he sent a crook back to the unit still wearing his suit, while another managed to keep a t-shirt with a bikini-clad woman on it. Maybe 2 weeks after graduating from the course, I came in for an afternoon shift, and when I walked into the tea room to put my lunch away, a few of the admissions staff sat at the table during a moment of downtime. "How the fuck did that mate of yours graduate the course?" One of the guys yelled at me from across the room, and a combined groan rolled across the rest of them. That pretty much summed up the impression Tony Malone left on his team those first couple of weeks, and I don't think they ever really changed after that, other than heading even further south. He was a team member devoid of public awareness, a man with the uncanny ability to piss off inmates and officers alike. The thing that annoys me the most is that in all the years I knew him and got to see the consequences of his actions, I don't think he ever really copped one, either physically or professionally. Sure, people would go off at him and scream about his latest annoyance, but I never heard of any of the inmates getting physical with him the way they did other officers. I also never saw him get anything more than a slap on the wrist from the bosses, not even when he caused one hell of a fuck-up during a prisoner release. I went back through past books to see whether I've told this story before, but couldn't find it. So, if I have, then I sincerely apologize. I did mention it briefly and screwed up, but not enough for the details to hit home. This happened one morning during a routine release where the crook wasn't just getting released from the prison, but he was also being deported back to his home country. Deportations are a common occurrence in our line of work. Not something that happens daily, of course, but enough times during the year to consider it a repeated event. Drug couriers are one of the more common types, caught at the airport, sent to the prison to serve their time, and then onto a plane back home. The crook in this particular tale had been deemed unsuitable to remain in our country due to repeated criminal convictions. At just 19 years old, this kid's entire family lived in Australia, and despite repeated appeals for him to remain in the country, each was denied. Because of said deportation, Border Force needed to come and interview the prisoner before his release to advise him of the details, as well as to enlighten him as to the procedure. Once finished, a private security detail came to cuff said prisoner, bundle him into a van, and take him to either the airport or an immigration detention center until his eventual departure. This security detail normally numbered between 4 and 6 people, led by one who took care of the paperwork. The inmate to be released turned up with his belongings shortly after 10 that morning, and after processing his small amount of property and stripping him one final time, we handed him his civilian clothes. Once he dressed himself, I walked him around to one of the holding cells near the interview desks. We knew the deal, and so didn't really make a big deal about things, and since the kid behaved himself, nobody really took much notice. People had expected him to lose his shit, hence why he was escorted to admissions by a couple of tactical officers, but even they said how placid he was and remained in the distance. This kid sat quietly until the Border Force officer turned up, and then sat through that spiel for maybe 10 minutes. The security detail turned up maybe 10 minutes after that, and the girl leading the team handed the paperwork to me since I was the lucky one sitting on the logbook that morning. It also meant I was the one organizing any releases, as well as all incoming and outgoing prisoners. Everything was going just as it should. A few minutes after the duty soup gave his final interview, the prisoner was effectively handed over to the security detail, who also conducted a quick interview, took possession of his property, including any valuables he had, and then cuffed him. I watched as they escorted him out to the van and saw Tony Malone and another officer follow close behind. While the inmate was being loaded on, Tony and the woman leading the team stood back near the door and were chatting. The other officer had already returned back inside, since the crook clearly wasn't going to make an ass out of himself, and with no other inmates to process at that time, it was the perfect opportunity for a coffee. "Thinks he's going to chat her up, does he?" one of my colleagues snickered as he passed by, pointing to Tony still chatting to this lady. I laughed, but didn't respond. A minute later, I watched as she too climbed into the van, and Tony returned back inside. I entered the inmates' details in the logbook, reduced the overall prison population by 1, and moved on with my day. That was where it should have all ended, only it didn't. The van, the deported prisoner, the security team, they had all already vanished from my mind when I received a phone call from the Sally Port about 10 minutes after disappearing around the far wall. "Hey, Simon, that immigration van is on its way back to you," the control officer told me. At first, I didn't know what the hell he was talking about. "Huh? That last inmate you wrote out, the deportee, he's on his way back to you. The immigration woman will fill you in." I hung up, still confused, but when I checked the monitor, saw the van coming back through the gate towards our building. When it finally pulled up back where it had left from just minutes before, the woman climbed out and I went out to meet with her. What I heard next still makes me shake my head to this day. The woman leading the security detail was literally on her very first field trip, having just graduated from her own course. She was 19, impressionable, and, as it turned out, inexperienced for bullshit. Tony's past had him working with juvenile offenders, and he just happened to know the inmate getting departed that day. He'd mentioned knowing him a few times during that morning, but since he loved gloating about himself, none of us really paid him too much attention. Turned out he really needed someone to listen to him. While he was standing outside with a girl and waiting for the team to load the inmate into the van, Tony decided to tell this young girl, a girl already nervous about standing inside a maximum security prison, that the inmate they were loading had a history of assaulting staff. Not only that, but that he was also deemed an extreme flight risk and that her team needed to keep a careful eye on him. Can you imagine what must have gone through this girl's mind at that point? I found out later from the Sallyport officer that the second the van pulled up inside, she jumped out and immediately went to the locker holding her mobile phone. It was her own control room she phoned, saying that someone had made a mistake by sending her team and that she needed a specialist squad to take the inmate. A specialist squad is the one with the bulked-up beefcakes, if you will. Highly trained for difficult transfers. This was the team you called when you had someone who didn't want to go and needed an extra bit of persuasion. Hearing this, I could do nothing more than sit there shaking my head. I did call out for Tony, and when he finally showed up, I asked him what the hell he'd told the girl. He denied saying anything specific, but didn't deny telling her the inmate had previously assaulted staff and that he was a flight risk. When the duty soup eventually showed up, he checked the prisoner's prison records, and what do you know? Not a single infraction. Zip. He'd been a model prisoner for the 8 months he'd been inside, worked a job in the kitchen, and had nothing but good things written about him by the officers manning his unit. The matter eventually made it all the way up to the general manager's office, where Tony had to explain himself. And while he did get a stern talking to, the matter didn't go any further. No written warning or anything like so many of us were expecting. Tony Malone is one of those officers who can determine the course of not only a single shift, but people's entire careers. He's one of those officers who I constantly kept my eyes out for because I knew the amount of trouble they could create in a short amount of time. Be aware of them, and if you do happen to cross one of their paths, be sure to keep them on your radar so that you can prepare for whatever bullshit follows close behind. In case you're interested, Tony remains in the prison to this day, continuing just as he has for all these years. Each time I catch up with friends, I always tend to ask about a few names, his being one of them. The latest updates usually begin with an eye roll and a head shake, usually followed by the words, Did you hear about what he did when... Chapter 6. Prisons are a big place. When most think about working inside one of these facilities, perhaps one of the only images that comes to mind is of the correctional officer working inside a unit surrounded by screaming inmates. This might be true to a certain degree for those who end up spending the majority of their time inside a unit, but the reality is that countless opportunities exist for staff to explore. In this chapter, I'll take you through as many as I discovered during my own time inside and try and give a bit of a heads up on each one. Just be aware that while many of these can be applied for, the moment you step out of the training course, a few of them require on-the-job experience before anybody will consider you a candidate for them. Correctional officer. This is probably the position you'll most likely experience first. Other titles include prison guard, prison officer, screw, turnkey, kanga, as well as assortment of country-specific terms. The CO, as we refer to ourselves, performs multiple duties around the prison, with the main one being inside the actual units where you will supervise inmates throughout the day. You'll also most likely be expected to perform shifts during the night when most facilities tend to operate with reduced staff numbers while inmates remain locked inside their individual cells. As a CO working inside a unit, expect to unlock and lock cells, supervise inmates directly, monitor behavior, perform both strip searches and property searches, conduct inmate interviews to ensure an understanding of their mental state and personal rehabilitation goals, supervise meal distribution, report incidents, write various types of reports, organize visits, deal with aggressive behavior, distribute weekly shopping orders, supervise medical consumption. I'm sure more duties exist, but you get the idea. Make no mistake about it, working inside a unit can be hectic, with some days spent non-stop on your feet trying to get everything down. These are the days when hearing control announce the 10-minute mark before the final lockdown sounds like the sweetest music of all. On the other hand, there are also days when you do nothing more than sit in your little officer station and twiddle your thumbs as you watch the day play out in front of you. Those are the days when boredom eats away at you for hours and hours, and all you end up doing is staring at the clock. The possibility that you will work in any of the units is high, and I remember 2 out of our class who ended up going immediately into the long-term management unit and 2 who got themselves assigned to short-term management. Check out the chapter on units for a description on what they are. In the below descriptions of other areas staff tend to work their way through, there are also opportunities for brand new staff to get assigned. It all comes down to where the prison needs you most. The other thing not to forget during your course is how your trainers will be assessing your suitability for various roles throughout the course. So, if you have your eye on any of these roles, be aware of what they might be looking for, or even ask them. The supervisors. Nobody is ever promoted to a supervisory role straight out of training. But then again, I guess it all depends on their experience. In the case where a new prison might open and the place is looking to fill certain positions, then yes, you will be able to apply for such a role. But these kinds of opportunities are rare. Supervisors, or SUPs as we call them, are generally one up from a CO, overseeing either one or a number of units depending on your prison. We also had a duty supervisor who took charge of everybody working as a CO, including running the rosters and various areas around the place. SUPs are also the people we COs call when we need something fixed or cleared, or when a crook doesn't get the answer he wants and demands to speak to one of them. The managers. Managers rank one level above supervisors and are usually the ones working 15-hour days while trying to run the prison through those working under them. The kinds of places they manage include accommodations, units, security, intelligence, plus, of course, the big two, the general manager and his deputy. The following are some of the more specialized areas you might find yourself applying for, or even offered straight out of training. Intel. This is where you get to go through prison mail looking for secret messages, trying to break codes, and searching for any insight into contraband coming into the jail. Intel is a crucial area and can offer quite a rewarding experience. Control room. Enjoy staring at screens? This is the hub of operations, where officers monitor cameras as well as radio communications. They respond to critical messages, raise alarms when necessary, control key safes, control weapons and ammunition, plus a whole host of other duties. Things can get hectic fast in this place, while some nights you'll spend endless hours watching movies. Reception. Imagine working the front door of the prison, dealing with all manner of people wanting to get into the place. Not only will you be dealing with the general public and those arriving to visit their loved ones, but also official visitors like lawyers, religious visitors, medical visitors, educational support staff, plus so many more. You will also monitor prison staff coming and going throughout their shift, handle body searches and X-ray equipment, incoming mail, and so much more. This is another area that can operate well above what some consider normal. Factories. Every prison will have some sort of work available for inmates. This might be any number of possibilities, depending on what your prison offers surrounding businesses. In ours, we did everything from building wooden pallets to cleaning plastic furniture for party hire places, as well as the good old nuts and bolts for inmates to spend hours twisting one onto the other. There's usually some sort of tailoring factory, a plate shop, plus loads more possibilities. If you have any kind of trade behind you, consider using it to get into one of the factories. GDs. The good old GD is viewed by some as the backbone of any prison. These are the folks who step in when someone needs to go home early, take up posts during lunch breaks, escort medical trolleys, collect inmate files, and plug up the gaps left by staff calling in sick. They also man gates that need to be monitored, with them checking identifications and movement slips. During my time, I found that a lot of people fresh off course preferred GD roles as it gave them a chance to experience a whole lot of prison life within one role. Kitchen. Every prison has a kitchen, and every kitchen needs officers to keep an eye on the working inmates. While several hired chefs will take care of menus and stock ordering and stuff like that, inmates will normally prepare ingredients, cook the food, clean up the place, and help the chefs in any way they can. There are also plenty of sharp utensils to play with and lots of food to try and smuggle out, so officers will have their work cut out for them. No pun intended. Laundry. Just like every prison has a kitchen, so do they have a laundry. This is where the uniforms get sent to be cleaned, the ones held in admissions to hand out to newly arriving inmates. It's also where the bedding is cleaned, as well as any civilian contracts that might need the use of an industrial laundry. Medical wing. The infirmary, the hospital, medical wing, whatever it's called in your neck of the woods, this is where the prison's sick go to be treated. Usually lined with cells, think of this as more of a ward where inmates might recover from more serious conditions or to get better from illnesses unsuitable for remaining in the units. This is also where doctors and dentists have their offices, as well as any other medical support staff such as counselors, etc. Support staff. The support staff is who operates any number of different services required by the prison, such as the sally port, outside escorts, and medical support staff. Outside escorts are usually needed for inmates who have medical appointments outside the jail. This might include those suffering from debilitating diseases such as cancer. Escort staff are also used for inmates needing to attend funerals and generally will be armed during such external escorts. Medical support includes those needed to escort inmates to medical appointments or just to collect their medications throughout the day. While some may be delivered directly to the units via medical trolleys, others need to be dispensed in more appropriate surroundings. Management units. I put these down separately as compared to normal units. Management units sometimes require specially trained staff to work in them, although don't expect this rule to be upheld when the jail is short-staffed. I should know. Both long-term and short-term management units are used for inmates who have either broken rules, have been involved in assaults, or just need an extra level of protection. The long-term management unit in our jail, Murray North, also known as the Slot, is also what you might know better as solitary confinement. While I myself spent quite a few night shifts in these units, as well as a few days, some of my most vivid memories came from Murray North, something I know I shared time and again through this series. Personally, I hated nights in Murray North. The constant mind games, noise, and confrontations were just the tip of the iceberg. You might be different. I have friends who still work in there to this day and seem to take it all in their stride. It is definitely not a unit considered boring, with each and every day providing some sort of incident, even if it's just a bunch of residents engaging in an argument between cells. Special Ops. Tactical units, tactical operation groups, whatever you want to call these guys, these are the officers who dress in combat gear ready for a fight. When dressed in their full riot gear, inmates refer to them as Ninja Turtles, the ones who sit in when all hell breaks loose. In our prison, these were also the only officers to carry any sort of weaponry, with the rest of us giving nothing more than keys and a handheld radio. If action is what you crave, and I mean non-stop, in-your-face confrontation, then this is probably the unit for you. Canine Unit. If working with canines is in your sights, then be prepared for one almighty fitness test. This role would have been at the very top of my own list were it not for the fitness needed to get accepted. Think about how fit a dog is, and you might have a fair idea of what's expected of you. One of my own friends ended up applying and ultimately succeeding in winning himself a role within the canine unit, and he told me it just about killed him. Was it worth it? He told me it was and would gladly go through the pain of applying again. There are two types of dogs you could be matched with, both playing a very exclusive role within the prisons. PAD, Passive Alert Detection dogs. These are the cute Labradors who work over the mail and units, sniffing out contraband, and are perhaps the friendlier of the canine units. Multi-purpose dogs. Love controlling a set of frothing teeth on steroids? These are your typical German Shepherds that leave a trail of destruction and drool behind after tearing through a unit. These dogs can get so excited with the prospect of unleashing their built-in set of blades that they can bite anything and everything if given the chance. One of these dogs regularly nipped anyone dumb to venture too close, and at one point ripped his handler's arm to shreds when it came between the dog and the inmate they were trying to subdue. Vacancy. This department is responsible for not only determining suitable cell allocations for all incoming prisoners, but also has the critical job of determining which inmates can play together. Imagine drug dealers and drug users, with one owing the other money and having already been attacked for them. Imagine one inmate who might have committed a crime against another one's family, or one inmate being a witness in another's trial. Hundreds of reasons exist as to why inmates may be unable to live with certain other inmates and vacancy are the ones who keep up-to-date records on every single prisoner coming into the jail. Admissions. A place I know only too well, given my own time spent in here. Admissions is the only place in the entire prison visited by every single inmate who will work their way through this place on their way to their unit. Not only that, but they will also eventually end up returning through these corridors on their way out again, if eligible. Make no mistake that if you work in here, you will have days where you won't know yourself, the tasks numbering in the hundreds as you work to clear through a backlog of dozens who need processing. You will also strip countless inmates, process property, interview inmates, and also escort prisoners to their units. Admissions is for many their very first taste of prison life, and you will find many of the fresh-faced prisoners extremely nervous. It is during their initial interviews that you will find out their next of kin details, their mental state, as well as any issues they might have. I've seen some officers treat this part of the process as nothing more than a quick tick and flick, so just be aware of the ramifications if you do. Every step of an inmate's processing is a critical step in the process designed to save lives and create a safer environment for all. Visitor Center. One of only 2 locations within the prison where you will deal with the general public. Visits can be quite an emotional time for not only the visiting family, but also the inmates themselves. I've seen how quickly things can spiral out of control when these parties are given their 5-minute warning or told that a visit has been canceled due to any number of reasons. One of the worst incidents during my time inside came from an inmate having his visit canceled on the spot and the prisoner and his father going on a rampage that left 6 officers injured, a number knocked out cold. The situation could have been avoided were it not for an overzealous officer throwing her weight around. Don't do it. That's my advice. Remember where you are and who you're dealing with. Working in the visit center is also more than just sitting in the room and monitoring inmates and their families. You might also find yourself out the back processing prisoners in and out of the building, which includes all important strip searches. Remember that visitors are one of the key entry points for contraband, and these people know what they're doing. I hope I've given you a decent indication of some of the places you might find yourself working in if you choose to apply. Many of these offer quite a unique perspective during the course of your duties, and my suggestion is to embrace the experience. Remember, not everyone gets the opportunity to work inside a prison, and I still believe it to be one of the most eye-opening experiences of my life. Chapter 7. So, what kind of units does a prison have? In the previous chapter, I shared some of the more specific roles you might fulfill during the course of your day. In this chapter, I want to share more information about some of the units you might find yourself in. Given the vast differences between them, I think it's only fair for me to try and show you just how each one's inmates can determine the outcome of your day. Before I go into what each unit actually has, I want to point out something that might factor in when you head to your own prison. The one I worked in was fairly new, built during the last decade of the last century. As such, the layout of the prison itself is vastly different from those built much earlier, with the design so much more modern. Old prisons were built around needing to keep an eye on inmates as a whole due to the lack of surveillance equipment. Back in the days before CCTV, it was the guards who needed to watch the crooks personally, and they did this by having eyes on them all the time whenever they left their cells. That's why cells only had a basic toilet, with no shower facilities. Those were usually located at one end of the unit and open for all inmates to use as needed. The mess hall was another place where inmates would all congregate for meals, the place where the movies would always show someone getting stabbed or riots breaking out. The old prisons also had 1 or 2 exercise yards. perhaps the only place where the majority would come together whenever let out of their cells. New prisons aren't like that at all. The cells alone have been completely redesigned, now offering much more than just a bed and a toilet. The first priority in the newest designs is removing any and all possible hanging points. Suicide prevention ranks high amongst the chief concerns, and so every cell is completely refined, with any possible hanging point redesigned or removed. What's a hanging point, I hear you ask? It's a point where someone is able to tie a torn strip of bedsheet, a shoelace, or some other kind of rope to and then hang themselves from it. The last person who ended their own life by hanging in our prison was a guy who used a torn sheet from his bedsheet, but instead of tying it to something in his cell, which he couldn't, he fed it through the crack in the door where the hinge sat, tied it off, and then simply waited. He prepped it during the day, and when the officers went around that night and locked the doors, nobody thought to check as it had never been done before. Sadly, the inmate succeeded. The cells also now have complete bathroom facilities, including a heated shower, sink, and a flushing toilet. They have a desk, chair, single or double bunk, a small 12-inch screened television, a window, and shelves. The doors themselves also give inmates added privacy, with nothing but a closable window for the officers to access if they need to see inside. The layouts of the units have also changed drastically. Rather than the inmate population needing to go to a mess hall for every meal, each unit has its own kitchen from which to serve meals that are prepared in the prison kitchen and brought to units in trolleys by the unit kitchen billets. Only breakfast isn't communal, with each unit having toasters and cereal for inmates to prepare their own. Units have communal areas for socializing, their own fenced-off yards outside, their own laundry, plus unit fridges. What else could they possibly need? As I said, prisons have changed so much in recent years, evolving into virtual homes for the inmates. Perhaps that is why so many of them would rather spend their years inside, where everything is provided for them, instead of having to face the constant struggles of surviving modern society on the outside. Anyway, let's head to the units. Long-term management. Going by many different names in many different countries, this is one unit I know exists in just about every prison across the world. Solitary confinement, the slot, the hole. These units house some of the meanest, nastiest criminals around. They hold those who broke the rules in some ways or another, giving staff a place to send prisoners needing some time to think about their actions. The thing to remember about this unit is that there is very little distinction between mainstream inmates and protection inmates. In this unit, they share the cells between them, and this adds another element of difficulty when officers need to move them around. Separation is the key in these units, with officers required to keep movements to a minimum. In the one I worked in, the crooks remained locked in their cells for 23 hours a day, with their 1 hour out of the cell spent in one of 6 outside yards. These exercise yards aren't bigger than a few meters, but give inmates some fresh air and a space slightly larger than the cell itself. And since the other yards also hold crooks, it also offers up a chance for some conversation. It can be quite the challenge moving crooks in and out of these yards throughout the day, and while some often pass on the opportunity, the majority of inmates choose to use their time out of their cells. 2 to 3 of the officers employed in the unit normally spend the entire day moving crooks in and out. But getting the prisoners out of their cells for their hour of exercise isn't the only duty performed by officers. There's handing out the meals, doing the laundry, organizing transfers both in and out of the unit. There are interviews to conduct, visits to organize, plus so many more duties. If you choose to work in here, be aware that you will be under the pump most days. Short-term management. This unit is almost the same as the long-term management unit, with one key difference. Inmates generally don't spend a huge amount of time in this unit. The reason is that short-term management is where a prisoner ends up after leaving long-term management. This is their step down from the hole and the unit they sit in before returning out to Gen Pop, or general population. Mainstream. The bulk of the prison population lives in mainstream units. In our prison, we have more mainstream units than any other kind, and each one usually runs at near capacity, housing some 60 to 80 crooks in each. Single occupancy and dual occupancy make up the majority, although a few of the units also have 1 or 2 triple occupancy cells. Mainstream units run in a fairly standard way, with cells unlocked in the morning and usually remaining that way throughout the day until lockdown at night. Those who want to work during the day have their cells locked again, especially if in a single cell. Their belongings wouldn't last long if the cell was left unlocked during their absence. Those who don't work have access to the main yard, the smaller exercise yard, a variety of footballs, gym equipment, a large screen television, a pool table, table tennis, plus a variety of board games, jigsaws, and playing cards. Yes, they have it good in here, with plenty of equipment to keep their brains active. People might be opposed to the idea, but I can tell you that a person bored and restless with very little focus in their life becomes dangerous. Do I agree with them having these items to use? Personally, I try not to have an opinion, as having one will make no difference to whether they actually do or not. Nothing will change because of my opinion, and, as such, it makes my job that much easier by focusing my energy elsewhere. The units also have a working laundry area, a kitchen, as well as unit fridges for the inmates to keep their drinks and leftover food in. It is also the place where officers tend to find most of the contraband during their searches, something you will definitely undertake if you work inside one of these. Protection. People don't realize this, but there are actually different types of protection units. These units are known by various names, and the inmates within are known by yet more names made infamous by movies, literature, social media, and just common knowledge. The boneyard is what we called it, the inmates living inside known as boners. You might know them as rock spiders, rats, or some other derogatory term, but they all mean the same. Segregation units exist for a number of reasons and are perhaps one of the fastest growing categories of units. When my prison first opened its doors, it had just the one protection unit. By the time I walked out for the final time, it had 4, as well as protection prisoners spread out amongst 4 other units. Protection, or segregation, isn't just about prisoners convicted of sex crimes. Yes, the majority of inmates in those units might be made up of those who committed vile acts against children, women, or even animals, but they are definitely not the only ones. Snitches are another common resident of these units, those who gave information on other inmates. There are also those who owe debts out in Gen Pop, owing substantial amounts they cannot pay. Drug addicts usually opt for protection rather than face the consequences of ringing up debts. Terrorists, arrested for crimes against the population, also usually end up here, as well as any law enforcement officers convicted for crimes. If you decide to work in these units, be aware that you will come into contact with people guilty of some of the most confronting crimes imaginable. Not only that, but you will also be the one shielding them from harm if ever escorting them around the prison. Personally, I've met a man responsible for snapping the spine of a baby during a drug-fueled rampage against his girlfriend, someone who threw their child off a bridge, a man who chopped his girlfriend to pieces, a man guilty for producing child porn, and dozens of crimes just as bad. Looking after these people feels like going against everything you stand for, and yet there you are, doing just that. So, how do you do it when every fiber of your soul is screaming for you to beat the shit out of them? to pick up the nearest chair and beat the living fuck out of them. You remind yourself that you aren't there to deliver justice, but to uphold it. It's not easy at times, nor is it comfortable. There were times when I would drive home in tears after a shift because I'd come into contact with one of the fuckers. You could go insane trying to figure out the rights and wrongs of your job. You could literally drive yourself crazy working out whether what you were doing is right. For me, I just reminded myself that I wasn't there to deliver justice or to make them pay for their crimes. Their punishment is having their freedom taken away. Their punishment, as handed down by a court of law, is to be locked up inside the prison and denied the freedom to walk out. I eventually didn't want to know what a person did. It just made my job all the more difficult. They were crooks, all of them. Their crimes don't matter once inside a unit. Sure, other inmates might take it upon themselves to deal out some kind of justice, but not officers. Our job is already hard enough without adding that to it. Anyway, you get the idea of what you'll expect to find if you choose to work inside protection. Specialty units. Not every unit falls under the simple label of mainstream and protection. There are some units around the prison where both intermingle with each other. Both long-term and short-term management units fall under this category, as do impairment units. Our prison had a unit specifically for those inmates with mental impairment, unable to function on their own, especially out amongst the general population. Minders live amongst them, of course, and help out in so many different ways. If you have any experience working with these types of people in your past, then it might be one unit you could consider using your skills in. Medical units. This area is another place where both mainstream and protection units coexist, although they still require separate routines. In our prison, each category would be let out of their cells for either the morning or the afternoon. The routine flipped around from one week to the next. Working here as an officer is a lot easier than in a standard unit, as a lot of the usual duties don't exist here. You generally conduct musters, give medical staff access to the cells when needed, and organize unlocks when called for. Our medical wing also had a few observation cells where those on suicide watch are housed, but that's about it. Psych unit. This unit is something of a hybrid between a standard unit and a medical wing. It houses both mainstream and protection prisoners, with inmates understanding that if they screw up, they go straight back out to Gen Pop. The kind of prisoners held in this type of unit are the ones with definite mental issues. Think of it as a mental asylum, but shrunk down to fit inside a prison unit. Hopefully, I've given you a decent rundown of some of the units you might find yourself working in. The experiences in each can vary so much, and I doubt I ever found myself bored in any of them. If given the choice out of any of them to work again, I'd probably have a tough time choosing, as they each have cons and pros to offer. My suggestion is to try them all for yourself and see what you prefer. Chapter 8. One of the things you will undoubtedly face during the course of your duties is the possibility of a confrontation. While these tend to happen on a daily basis, how you react to them may determine the ultimate outcome. Prison units are a volatile environment at the best of times, and many new officers fail to appreciate just how fragile the peace really is. Let's set the crimes aside for a moment. Forget about what an inmate might have done to get themselves sent to prison in the first place. I just want you to focus on them being in prison for the time being and explore what state of mind they may be in. Imagine being held against your will in a place surrounded by others held against their will, away from your loved ones. Your life now exists inside a unit filled with all manner of personalities, many of whom want nothing more than to dominate the rest of the unit. This is a place where the jungle rules apply, where the strongest survive and the weak serve the rest. Wolves and sheep, dog eat dog. Whatever saying you want to throw in here, That is the reality of a prison unit. These men live in a world of constant threats, where nothing is safe. Your belongings make you a target. People watch for any sign of weakness, and they search for your vulnerabilities, whatever they may be. Inmates quickly join gangs for protection, or try to remain in their cells to avoid highlighting themselves. Imagine you yourself sent to one of these places and how you might react once inside. The other thing that might determine how a day pans out is an individual's mood. Let's say that 10 minutes before you walked into the unit, they received news that their visit had been canceled, or their loved one couldn't make it, or perhaps a loved one had fallen ill or even died. And now you walk in and they ask you for a pen with a bit of attitude, and you take it personally and tell them to take a hike. Men under pressure, and women of course, will eventually snap. And when that happens, it will come down to you and how you handle it. Will you take offense at the insults, or will you ignore them and deal with the issue head-on with composure? I've seen both sides play out, and I can tell you now that reacting to insults will never get you far. Some of the best officers I've seen in action remain unbelievably calm under the most stressful confrontations. Something I learned early on is that when you're outnumbered 20-1, it pays to know how to talk your way out of issues, because talking is probably your biggest weapon. Speaking of weapons, there's a very good reason you don't get armed when preparing for a shift inside the unit, and that is because the chances are high of you getting disarmed and having those weapons turned on you. Attacks happen frighteningly fast, and if someone comes for you, I doubt you'd have enough time to pull your baton or pepper spray out anyway. If you do get to carry those on you in your prison, make sure you monitor anybody near you, because it's not difficult to snatch them from an unsuspecting officer. What you're better off doing is learning how to deal with inmates without needing to resort to that level of violence in the first place. Sure, sometimes it's unavoidable, but I've seen things kick off more times because of the way an officer handled the situation. Some seem to think that when they put on the uniform, they automatically grow a few inches and lose their vulnerability. Trust me, you don't. The uniform gives you nothing but a target for inmates to focus on. Walk confidently, sure, but not to the point of looking like you want to take everybody on. Like I said before, one of your biggest tools is your mouth, but there's an important reason why you have just the one mouth while having two ears on the side of your head. Sometimes, listening is far more important than talking, and it helps to use your ears when a crook is trying to tell you something. Something I learned during a course I did a few years back, one designed to help deal with irate customers. You might consider throwing this advice into your toolbox, as it's something handy for more than just prison confrontations. When someone yells at you about whatever is pissing them off at that moment, repeat what they say in a calm manner. Here's one incident I remember only too well. This happened in a unit where I had been asked to step in while another officer headed out for their lunch break. The two others in the station looked under the pump with an audience of inmates standing before them with requests. One in particular looked pissed, and I could see him just itching for a fight. Inmate: "Boss, can you check that single cell list?" Officer 1: "I told you after." Inmate: After. I've been asking you since this morning." Officer 1, turning to the inmate and pointing at him: "Look, fuck off right now. Can't you see I'm busy?" The inmate at this point scrunched up the paperwork he had in his hand and threw it at the officer. Officer 1: "Right, get to your fucking cell before I call a code." Officer 2: "Lock the cunt down." Officer 1: "I will if he doesn't go to his cell." Inmate 2: "Boss, he's next on the list to move, and Jones left this morning. He just wants the cell, that's all." Officer 1: "I don't give a shit about cells right now. He could have waited." That entire situation escalated when it didn't need to. What's worse is that each participant also acted in a way where they would then need to follow through with more. The rest of the unit watched all this unfold, with quite a few standing up on the second-tier landing and looking down over the officer station. Once the officer threatened to lock him down, the rest of the inmates would have waited to see if he followed through with the threat. If he didn't, then they would take that as a sign of weakness. The crook, on the other hand, cracked the shits and threw the request form he'd been intending to hand in, and then yelled abuse as he walked away, a definite challenge to the officer. Granted, there are times, lots of times, when inmates lack any hint of patience. But we as officers already know that, which is why we know how to deal with it. Swearing and pointing a finger the way Officer 1 did is not the way to deal with that situation, regardless of how much of a cunt the crook is being. All you are doing is challenging them to react in front of the unit, and believe me, when an inmate has to save face in front of his peers, they'll do whatever it takes. Don't buy into it. Yes, they can get needy, and yes, they can get loud, but these guys have an image to uphold, and when crooks watch each other, anything goes. Now, I'm not saying my way is the right way, nor that it's the only way. What I am saying is that it works for me and saved me plenty of confrontations, both in and out of prison. Inmate: Boss, can you check the single cell list? Me: Single cell list, yes. Let me finish with these guys first, and I'll call back so we can check it. Speaking calmly, the crook isn't losing face by some officer calling him names or abusing him. More importantly, though, I've repeated to him what he asked, which means he knows that I not only heard him, but I'm also letting him know that I understand his request. I then offer him a simple solution, where I don't have to drop everything to bow to his needs, and I get to finish what I'm doing. This solution doesn't always work, because, let's face it, there will always be inmates who demand you drop everything for them. That's just how shit rolls in here. But if they do decide to escalate things, then you are more than within your right to lock them down and dish out whatever punishment you see fit. The important thing to remember here is that it wasn't you who escalated things. Inmates will always be watching. It mightn't always be obvious, but I can guarantee you that they are. Even when the entire unit is locked down and they're sitting behind closed cell doors, they'll still be watching and listening and checking how you deal with things. Weakness in any form in this place will bring repercussions. Just be aware of that. Every challenge requires a response, and crooks will throw a few random ones out there to see how you deal with them. One other point to make here is about how you treat prisoners one-on-one. I often speak about their crimes and how you will need to decide early on whether you want to know what they did or whether you'd prefer not to know. It's a personal choice, and something I personally found after a year or two is that you stop caring. Yes, there will be those on the extreme end of the crime spectrum, those who cause headlines to run across front pages for days on end, but they're usually rare. The rest you end up shrugging aside and just dealing with. Their crimes, however, aren't the only consideration you need to take into consideration. I've mentioned the ranking system before, where each inmate is assigned a rating for certain categories based on their history. Your prison may have its grading system set up a little differently than ours, but I can almost guarantee that we'll have some form of it within its processes. In ours, we give our inmates several ratings, and these will be highlighted wherever their name appears. Movement lists are where I usually found them, indicating who it was we were dealing with. The ratings are pretty easy to read. Each category is highlighted by a letter, followed by a number, with the numbers going from 1 to 5. V is for violence. P is for psychiatric state. E is for escape risk. M is for medical status, and S is for suicide state. These 5 categories will be a goldmine of information for you. One look, and you can immediately see what type of prisoner you're dealing with. If they're a V1, then you know to watch your back. In our prison, anytime a V1 had to be moved, they would require handcuffs as well as tactical officers for the escort. S1s normally sat on observation cells, needing a visual check every 15 minutes. If they were deemed less of a risk to themselves after a few days, then they would be classified down to an S2. The inmates would all eventually be downgraded to S3 status, at which point they would be returned to their normal cell. The thing is, their crimes aren't mentioned in these ratings. They don't matter. What does matter is their propensity for violence, or escape, or threats of suicide. Can you think of one other thing that you might want to know about them, but unfortunately can't, unless the inmate is willing to tell you themselves? Diseases. Privacy rules mean an inmate could be walking around with HIV, but you don't get to know. So, if they ever got worked up and pissed off enough that they want to spit in your face, then you have no way of knowing just who it is that's assaulting you. Yes, it's wrong, but that's the law, and we have to deal with it. Confrontations can happen at any moment, and for little to no reason. One of the problems you need to avoid early on is trying to categorize inmates. Something I was told repeatedly early on was to treat them all the same. Every one of them is entitled to the same things, yes, but they are also all the same when it comes to other things. For one, I consider every inmate to be infected with HIV. Every single one of them. If I assume them all to be infected, then I won't need to worry about how I'm going to treat each one individually, and the same goes for violence. Whenever I came into contact with crooks, I made sure that I exercised the same caution regardless of who they were. I didn't care about their age, their race, their size, their unit, or nothing. To me, they're all the same, and the easiest way to deal with them is as a whole. Give them what they're entitled to. That way there's no distinction between them. Believe them all to carry some disease, and you will find yourself gloving up each and every time you come into contact with them. Consider them all a threat, and you'll find yourself taking precautions whenever escorting them or interacting with them in any number of situations. I hope this chapter has given you a couple of tools that you can use once inside. The job isn't an easy one, but when armed with a bit of experience from someone who's been there, hopefully it will help make things a little more manageable for you. Chapter 9. It's nothing but water off a duck's back. Know how many times I heard those words spoken during my initial training? I swear it was at least daily, maybe even more. So why would I devote an entire chapter to words that you probably already understand just as much as me? Because nothing can prepare you for the onslaught of abuse you face once behind the walls of maximum security. The first thing I want to mention here has to do with the crooks themselves. From the moment you walk into a unit, you will be under constant surveillance, with dozens of eyeballs watching every single thing you do. The second they see you, each and every inmate will be building up a picture of you in their mind. They're building a story, a notebook of references, gaining an understanding of just who you are, not only as an officer, but also as a person. Think about what you are when it comes to the inmates. You are the door that's blocking them from the outside world, the wall, the barrier standing between them and what they want. If it wasn't for you, they could walk out of that unit, head to the front gate, and just leave. It is our job to make sure they cannot, to keep them locked up behind the walls and confine them to the unit. One way or another, these guys will figure you out. The kind of officer you are, sure, but that's just the tip of the iceberg. Wear a wedding band? Well, now they know something else about you. Have your children's names tattooed on your forearms? Another piece of the puzzle for them. A week after starting in the unit, you turn up late because of traffic. One of your offsiders asks you about being late, and you tell them there was a truck rollover on the freeway. A crook overhears you, watches the news later that day, and sees the rollover happening along a very specific stretch of road. Now they have another piece of the puzzle, and slowly, over a period of weeks, months, or even years, they continue building a picture of you. Try this one on. They see you studying the racing guide every morning. They figure you're a gambling man and start asking you for tips. Soon they offer you one, and it comes through. Now you're in their debt. Maybe not by much, but it's enough for them to take things a step further the next time. And the entire reason they continue building this picture of you is for one reason. I think one of the saddest things I ever saw was an officer graduate from his intake course, get allocated to one of the mainstream units, and within just a couple of years, end up facing drug charges. We spent a few shifts together, and he always seemed like such a switched-on kind of guy. I can't say we were friends exactly, but certainly good colleagues. We'd greet each other whenever we crossed paths, and from what I could tell, he was doing just fine. As it turned out, he wasn't. Some of the inmates in his unit cottoned on to the fact that he was married with a couple of young children. From what I could gather afterward, they somehow managed to get his home address and began threatening to set his house on fire if he didn't start bringing in drugs for them. Rather than go to his superiors, this guy did as they asked, and over the course of a few months, began smuggling in all manner of gear. He was eventually caught, of course, and immediately fired from the job. Worse still, the amount of drugs found on his person amounted to more than just casual usage, and he ended up with a couple of pretty heavy charges. Sadly, he went to court and ended up with a prison sentence. If you think prison is hell as an active correctional officer, imagine how bad it is for one locked up inside. And yes, the crooks not only saw him as a screw dog, but also as a weak screw dog. Thick skin, that's what you need. I thank my lucky stars that I was never approached in the way he was. Or maybe I was and just didn't notice. I did get asked a couple of times to hand over things they weren't entitled to, but always shut the requests down. I didn't consider their requests for a second. Maybe that was enough for them to realize that I wasn't someone about to give in. I go over this in a little more detail in the chapter about building relationships, but just to be clear, they never stop building a picture of you. Remember how I said that they will eventually test you? Having thick skin will help you to a certain degree. Some days, sitting in a unit is a little like standing on the pitch of a football stadium, not near the middle, but close to the edge, maybe just a few feet back from the fence. In front of you, the grandstand is filled with hundreds of people who detest the very essence of you. They scream non-stop abuse, cursing everything from your appearance to your dog and to your mother. All you can do is stand there and take it without any sort of reaction. Poker-faced, that's what you need to be. A poker face you keep in your back pocket, ready to be pulled out at a moment's notice. If they catch one hint that their insults affect you, things will elevate to the next level. Ever been called a cunt, a pussy, a donut-punching fag, a child-raping pedo? How about your wife or husband? How would you feel about a crook calling your wife a slut he'd fucked before she'd met you? Or a whore he used to pass around his mates? Insults in this place know no boundaries. Sure, you can react, lock them down, and take their TV for a night or two. But what good would that do? Now they know your sore point, the button they need to press in order to get a reaction. Thick skin. Ask yourself some common sense questions. Do they really know your wife or husband? Do they know anybody in your family, or are they simply fishing? Are you gay? Are you a kitty fiddler? The insults they throw at you are nothing more than attempts to push your buttons. I've been called more names than you can imagine. Hell, I used to compliment those I considered funny because some of them would at times actually be clever. Thick skin. Get used to it. Remember what I've said about this place in previous books. This place behind the walls is a completely different world from the one you know. Nothing from the outside exists here. It is an environment unlike anything you've ever experienced. Racism, sexism, bullying, they all live in this place on a scale that took me a very long time to get used to. Know that it exists before you go in, and your transition may not take as long. Chapter 10. Samuel Martin began working in corrections during the mid-90s, a time when prisons still resembled the battlegrounds of the 70s and 80s. Not a lot of rules existed, especially for those wearing the old guard uniforms. Someone mouthed off at you, and they immediately regretted it when you put them back in their place. For those who know Melbourne, Australia, Pentridge Prison is a name synonymous with just how bad maximum security was back then. The jail opened way back in 1851, and not much changed during its long reign as one of the worst prisons in the country. I worked with an officer who began his career inside Pentridge some 30 years earlier, and he once shared the interview process he went through to get the job. "Can you take a punch?" "Yeah." "Welcome aboard." Those were the days before all the bureaucratic red tape got involved, back when men settled their differences with a quick fisticuff and moved on with their day. Prisons operated under an entirely different set of rules, where officers carried a baton and weren't afraid to use it. Samuel didn't work in Pentridge, but he began his own career alongside a lot of the blokes who came across from there. Those officers brought their work ethics with them, and our prison became a place plenty of inmates feared, with Murray North the absolute worst of the worst. Officers would encounter inmates breaking down sobbing on the line the moment they stepped off the bus if they found out they were about to be sent to the unit. That was a place where Samuel gained his stripes. He spent 10 years inside before calling it quits, working his way up to supervisor and leaving with an absolute truckload of experience. The place must have left a mark on him because he returned a few years later and ended up in my intake class. Due to rules and regulations, he couldn't just stroll back into his job. He had to start fresh like a newbie, joining the rest of us on his way back inside. Funnily enough, Samuel ended up back in his old unit at the completion of the course, right back in Murray North as a regular correctional officer. I can't imagine how that must have been for him, to see so many changes to a place where the crooks used to shit themselves knowing they were headed there. What I loved more than anything was listening to Samuel's war stories, even more so when others from that time period joined in. I spent time in that unit when a few of them would get together and share some of those tales, and I'll tell you what, they were interesting. A long corridor peels off from the main unit in Murray North, with cells running the length of each wall. That is where most inmates first find themselves when assigned to the unit. What I remember most about that corridor is the echoes, the endless noise coming up through that corridor and out the door located right behind the officer station. Voices, banging, toilets flushing. Every tiny peep would echo like a concert hall. If a pissed-off inmate began banging up by kicking the shit out of their cell door, the noise reverberated around the entire unit, sending those out in the main part into a frenzy. I know. I spent many nights in the place putting up with that kind of crap. Samuel told me about this one time when a crook ended up in the slot for refusing a direct order back in his own unit. The tactical officers had to drag him up, kicking and screaming, and dumped him into one of the cells down that corridor. The second the cell door slammed shut, this prick began pounding on the door, relentlessly punching it over and over and over. The other crooks quickly began to call for blood, but this idiot refused to give up. Imagine Samuel's surprise when he returned the next morning, only to find the crook still banging up. The night shift officer told him that he'd stopped for a couple of hours in the early morning, but began banging up again the second he heard the officer's trolley come around for breakfast. When Samuel went to check on the inmate, he found him lying on the floor on his back, and rhythmically stomping on the door as if he were marching. Boom, 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 and on and on and on it went. Threatening this crook didn't work, and neither did negotiating. Whenever Samuel approached the trap, this crook would just continue his banging, drowning out any officer's voice with that constant metallic echo. If you have never experienced this sound for yourself, then I might not find the right words with which to describe it accurately enough for you. It's loud. Fucking loud. It feels like your brain vibrates from each thud, the noise causing physical pain in one's ears. Maybe these types of incidents were the ones responsible for my own eventual tinnitus. Rather than crack the door and enter the cell to rip this crook a new asshole, Samuel instead contacted the prison doctor to see whether he could do something. It definitely wasn't the usual choice for officers, but Samuel wondered if there mightn't be a more calm manner for dealing with the situation. The doctor ended up coming to the unit, and Samuel led him down to the cell where said inmate continued with his relentless pounding. The guy was committed to his cause, if nothing else. I wish I knew the name of this certain doctor, because what he did next can only be described as legendary. I do know he told me, but I apologize for letting it slip from my mind. I could make one up, but what's the point? This doctor first opened the small door covering the viewing window and peered inside. Just as before, the crook lay on his back and continued stomping on the door, one foot after the other in a slow, rhythmic pattern. Finally, the doctor opened the trap and called out to the inmate, "Hey! Hey! Can you hear me?" At first nothing, so he repeated himself, "Hey there! I'm the prison doctor. Can you hear me?" "Yes, I hear you," came the reply. The doctor looked at Samuel as he closed the trap, pulled out a pill bottle, and said, he can hear voices. These meds should calm him down." After grabbing a cup of water and handing one of the pills through the trap, the inmate took his meds, and while he did return to his previous antics almost immediately, he didn't last long, passing out a short time later. That doctor had a habit of taking care of unruly inmates, and Samuel told the story with just the right amount of enthusiasm. I cracked up laughing, imagining the doctor saying what he did. Humor had a way of pulling officers through some of the toughest shifts. Humor and some cheeky arrogance toward those locked up for heinous crimes. One of Samuel's old sidekicks once told me about the time he decided that crooks didn't deserve the gym equipment set up in the unit's common area. The home gym had been made available for inmates to use during their single hour out of their cells each day. The kind where a lot of cables and weights could be manipulated into various forms of exercise. Samuel couldn't stand the idea of such an expensive piece of equipment being left to a bunch of crooks, so he broke the setup down, carried each piece through to the staff room, and set it back up for the officers to use. When I asked him about it, he just grinned at me. They were different times back then, was all he said, and I could see how the place had changed since his early days. It didn't take long for Samuel to reach his previous rank and eventually surpass it. He's a manager now, in charge of a lot of people, and rightly so. He's a man who's been at the bottom, walked in the cesspool of the worst of society's rejects. One of the few who managed to survive those early years. I think he'll remain in the place until he retires. I hope he does. He's a good man with the kind of morals that make for a great officer. He taught me a lot. The man, one of the few I would have gladly gone into battle with. And while he continues working in that place to this day, I truly hope he comes out safely on the other side. Chapter 11. Remember back when I said that this place has a way of numbing you against the violence? How some of the most graphic injuries barely register to those who'd witnessed similar injuries in the past? This entire job has a way of changing you, and I want you to recognize this before you go in. I remember back when I first began in this role, how I would go home most nights and spend hours talking with my wife about all the weird shit I'd seen that day. She would listen to me for hours. And then on weekends during parties and barbecues, I'd literally have circles of people standing around me asking all sorts of questions. If you took that same person and compared him to who I was the last time I walked out of the prison, I doubt you would have thought of him as one and the same. This job, this place, it changes you. It mightn't feel like it happens all at once, but it eats away at you, taking a small nibble each and every shift until one day you wake up and realize that you don't like sharing anything about the job any longer. In fact, you love nothing more than to walk out through the front gate and leave the whole thing far behind. Don't get me wrong, there will be events that kick you in the head hard enough to rattle you. Maybe it will be your first dead body, or a horrific assault that leaves a trail of blood running across the unit. Maybe it's hearing about a colleague who passed away, or one getting attacked during the course of their day. Whatever it might be, there will be those moments that leave scars across your soul, the ones you will never forget and simply learn to live with. But then there are the everyday events, the mind-numbing shifts that seem to go on for weeks at a time, with you spending countless hours watching inmates doing the same old shit. There will be arguments, confrontations, and endless cycles of bringing new crooks in and taking crooks out. The one thing that splits the pack, I think, is the part where some never forget the place they work in, while others do. Remember that old friend of ours, complacency? Some officers quickly fall into a routine, especially when working in units, and somehow lose focus on the ever-present danger. When nothing much happens for days and weeks at a time, it's easy to consider the place just another normal place of business where you go through the same routine day in and day out. For others, they never forget, and I firmly believe it's that never forgetting part that maybe eats away at them and slowly numbs them to the outside world. I remember one of our trainers once telling us that he feels much more comfortable inside a prison than standing in some queue at a supermarket. At the time, I couldn't fathom ever feeling that way, but it didn't take long for me to not only understand it, but actually agree with him. When I'm walking around a prison, or standing in a unit dealing with endless requests, I know exactly who the person standing in front of me is. They are a prisoner, convicted of a crime, and possibly carrying some deadly disease that could hurt me and my family. I know exactly how to treat him. I understand what he's capable of. I recognize the danger I'm in, and so ensure I keep my alertness switched on. I have no idea who the hell is standing behind me in a supermarket queue. For all I know, it could be some guy who's just gone shopping for supplies after murdering someone. It could be a drug user who just popped a few pills and needs some extra cash from a quick robbery. The truth is, I have no idea who it is standing an arm's length behind me, and yes, it does make me uneasy. I've known a few law enforcement officers in my time, and have noted some similarities between them and correctional officers. We tend to look at people in a different way, usually sizing them up before lowering our walls. When we go to a cafe or restaurant, we prefer sitting around the edge of the room, usually with our backs to a wall so we can keep an eye on the general area. For me, I like to see what's going on and who is coming through the doors. It took maybe a year for my conversations to begin changing, but change they did. I found that I lost interest in sharing stories from work with those I knew and often kept to myself at parties. What I found was that I needed to keep work separate from my private life. It wasn't that I didn't trust those I hung around with or anything like that. What I believed happened was that I needed to keep the two parts of my life away from each other, so that I could switch between the two people living in those parts. Remember how I said that clocking on was the trigger for me to switch into work mode? Walking around on constant alert for 12 to 13 hours a day is tiring. It wears you out, and when it's time to go home again, the last thing you want is to still be lit up like that. Clocking off was the moment that awareness took a back seat. Of course, it was still there. Hell, even driving home these days opens a person up to all sorts of possibilities. But for me, it dialed down enough that I could relax again. While these changes might sound like a bad thing, I don't actually think they are. It's good to have a sense of awareness. It's also good to accept that shit happens, and when it hits the fan, to be prepared for it. I personally prefer sitting with my back to the wall so I can be ready for whatever happens, especially when out with family or friends. I don't know, maybe it's just my protective instinct taking over. Just realize that this job will change you, and those in your life will notice. It's not a bad thing to want to stop talking about a job that can have so much trauma surrounding it. I've seen couples break up because one of them stopped sharing all the details about their day. Maybe raise this possibility with your husband or wife ahead of time. Let them know that while you might be eager to share stories in the beginning, that same enthusiasm may not continue forever, and they should expect that. It has nothing to do with them personally. It doesn't mean you love them any less. It simply means you want a break from the constant shit that goes on behind the walls. Chapter 12. I often mention how prison is a completely different world to what people might recognize, and in this chapter, I want to share some of the things you'll need to understand before you head beyond the walls. Some of these will open your eyes to rules staff need to follow, while others share the prisoner code they all have to abide by. Just remember that these might be different to the environment you'll be going into. Staff and inmates, two sides of the same coin, with both trying to survive a hell on earth. Each has its own set of rules they need to abide by, with one side made to pay for breaking theirs with blood. Things weren't always clear to me during my first few months inside, but boy do you learn fast when thrown into the thick of things. It also pays to understand things from an inmate's point of view, especially when dealing with them in an unlocked unit in the middle of a hectic afternoon. For a correctional officer, there's no greater test than when an inmate challenges your authority. It's not just a test of your mental strength and courage, but also your character. Inmates want to see what you're made of, and if they can detect even the slightest hesitation, it won't be long before more tests come for you. It might not even be a blatant, in-your-face kind of test. One of the standard ones I personally encountered came from crooks walking into the unit without their shirts on, or keeping their baseball caps on their heads, both no-nos. The shirt is pretty self-explanatory. Wearing a cap inside the unit is another no due to them hiding an inmate's identity from the security cameras. The way this scenario usually plays out is that you'll be sitting in the officer station and a crook will walk past you with their cap on. They'll make sure they get eye contact with you to ensure you've seen them. At this point, you're expected to call for them to remove the cap. Nothing over the top, just a polite request. I've even witnessed officers turn this simple scenario into a code alpha through over-the-top demands and insults, maybe brought on by fear or just plain old adrenaline. The crook has two choices, to either comply with your demand or simply ignore it. Remembering that this is a test, I think it's obvious which path is the most likely chosen. They've made eye contact with you, you've asked them, and they've ignored you. Now what? Now, it comes down to what you feel a necessary response is. Many staff will simply stand and call out with a louder voice, projecting their authority across the unit. But what do you do if the crook still ignores you? Make a decision. For me, I'd get out of the station and head to where the inmate is either standing or follow them to their cell. I don't enter it, but stand out from the door enough so my colleagues can still see me. Then I deal with it. I question why they ignored me, and then either lock them down for the day due to disobeying a direct order, or I confiscate their TV for a night. Or, finally, I might just let them off with a warning. It all comes down to how that part of the argument plays out. This is where it pays to know something about prisoners. They have an image to uphold because, for them, such a situation is as much a test for them as it is for the officer. Those watching on are looking for weaknesses on both sides. I've locked down crooks where the second the door closes, they begin shouting and kicking their cell doors to show that they're not afraid. It's just their way of saving face. If an officer backs down at any point, it's a win for the crook, and you can bet your ass that more inmates will wear their caps inside. I've gone into units for a relief shift and found the entire unit walking around without shirts and caps on their heads because the regular staff had been too weak to stamp it out. And if you think that's bad, spare a thought for these next guys. This happened back in mid-2018, when Todd Waites had gradually turned from a unit everyone wanted to work in into one avoided like the plague. It probably transitioned from a decent unit into a sewer pit over the course of maybe 5 or 6 months, and boy did it end badly for those thrown under the bus. The problem came down to staff, nothing more. If you can see things from a distance, then you'll understand what I mean. See, crooks are crooks. They will take anything and everything they can have. If it ain't locked down, consider it gone. And the same can be said for the rules. They'll occasionally throw out a test or two, and if one just happens to pay off, then they continue fishing for more. Todd Waites, like so many other units, regularly gets a staff rotation. Out with the old and in with the new. The problem was, out of the 12 or so regulars who ended up assigned to the unit on the rotational roster, where 3 would be on duty at any one time, only 2 had more than a year of experience in the prison. The rest all from the previous 2 intakes. Do you know what that means when it comes to running a unit? Most days, just a single experienced officer sat in the officer station, and both of those assigned to the unit were some of the laziest I'd ever met. They'd be hard-pressed to go to the bathroom for a piss if they didn't absolutely have to. And these were the guys now in charge of 55 short to medium-term aggressive mainstream inmates. With the majority of staff not having the experience to work in such a unit, the test didn't take long to find holes, and these blokes took every advantage they could. Caps and T-shirts were just the tip of the iceberg, with quite a few cells holding considerable contraband. A couple of the crooks even kept the unit's electric fry pans in their cells for some after-hours cooking, something unheard of in the rest of the prison. And then it happened. The day the shit really hit the fan. 3 unfortunate blow-ins ended up working the unit this particular day. Remember, a blow-in is someone who isn't regularly assigned to a unit and only sent in as a relief worker when usual staff call in sick. Well, on this particular day, all 3 of the regulars called in sick, and the unit ended up in the hands of 3 partially experienced officers. I say partially because if they had any common sense at all, they would have handled things differently. By 10:30 that morning, the first code alpha came through after one of the officers attempted to remove one of the frying pans from a cell during the intercom checks. The staff called the second code alpha a half hour after yard time began, and inmates continued coming into the unit with their shirts off. The crooks had become so used to not wearing their shirts during yard time that they didn't think the rule actually existed anymore. Things eventually turned ugly to the point where 2 of the staff ended in a physical confrontation, and the unit was locked down for 2 days. The entire place ended up being searched by the tactical officers the next day and completely stripped of all contraband, regardless of how minor it was. It's so easy to forget the kind of place you're working in when each and every day feels like the last. Incidents become nothing more than eye-roll moments, your subconscious numb to them. Rules relax, duties become routine, and all the while, crooks are watching. My advice is to consider each and every infraction as them testing the waters and reacting to each appropriately. Don't let anything slide. Another rule to remember is that it's important to remember who you promise what to. I've seen too many incidents kick off because an officer made a promise to someone only to not follow through with it. It's easy to wave someone aside during a hectic moment, only to forget the promise entirely. Write it down or something, and the inmates will thank you for it. Respect goes both ways, and it's much better to have their respect than to deal with their wrath. Also, make sure not to show favoritism to one inmate over another. If you agree to allow one crook to use your pen, then you can't say no to another. Conformity matters. If a prisoner thinks you favored someone over them, the repercussions can be less than welcoming. Shit bombs have a tendency to fly in the direction of officers who chose when and where to allow certain privileges. Life isn't any easier on the other side. It's actually a lot worse, with repercussions usually ending in some level of violence. One rule they will enforce above any other is for snitching. If a crook rats on another, boy, do they have a world of pain coming for them. Snitches, rats, informers, whatever you want to call them, entire units exist to protect them. I took you through the various types of units in an earlier chapter and the kind of clientele they house. Rats are one of the definite residents of protection units. Snitching can take on many different forms, from evidence on the outside, such as police informers, to information on something going on the inside. Maybe someone told an officer about a planned hit, or some drugs making it into a unit, or fearing an attack on themselves and spilling the beans. I've also seen inmates get put into protection for simply being suspected of snitching. Some weren't even snitching at all, simply speaking with an officer in the wrong place at the wrong time. Here's something else to be aware of. There will be times when an inmate will refuse to talk to you behind closed doors. Being suspected of snitching is the reason for that. If you do find yourself in a situation where you know an inmate has something to tell you, the best place is generally standing at the door of their cell with them inside, such as lockdown time. Another way some inmates will communicate with officers is through anonymous letters through the mail. Each of our stations has a mailbox slot, and it's generally cleaned out at the end of every shift. I can't tell you how many of those anonymous notes are found each and every week. The most common note we find is about the safety of a certain inmate, or perhaps even an officer. If someone is doing something wrong, and a crook with a conscience notices, they may warn other officers ahead of time, maybe to prevent an attack of some sort. I've seen notes calling for inmates to be moved out of a unit because of a death threat, and I've also seen what happens when those notes get ignored. Another type of message they might send might come as a surprise to you. It's not that uncommon for inmates to drop notes about either impending or recently landed drug shipments. Yes, drugs. Why would crooks dob themselves in, do you think? For one thing, not all people react to drugs the same. Like alcohol, some inmates might take drugs and be happy, some quiet, some violent, some confrontational. Who knows? Unfortunately, some drugs turn normally placid people into raging psychotics who end up trying to take on the entire unit. Prisoners have been known to end up with severe injuries thanks to getting the shit kicked out of them by someone high or whatever gear had hit the unit. Anonymous notes aren't rare, but if a unit suspects someone of snitching, they usually start pointing accusatory fingers, and that is when things can take a turn. Someone completely innocent might find themselves on the receiving end of said accusation, and that is when they need help protecting themselves. The bottom line is that snitching is a definite no-no, although that isn't the only act inmates do not tolerate. Want to know what another unsuspecting rule is? No stealing. In a room full of thieves, stealing is a definite no. Get suspected or accused of stealing something and can't prove your innocence, and you can expect to have some fingers broken. Or worse, depending on the mood and the situation. There are more rules, of course, many of which you will learn once inside your own prison. There will be obvious ones like never taking a shit during lockdown times if in a dual occupancy cell. Having stuck my face into a trap of one occupied by two men where one did just that, I can attest to why that rule is in place. It ain't pretty, believe you me. Then there will be rules most inmates may not even be aware of, including those only pertaining to your own prison. Those are what I would be asking my trainer about during your intake course. A while back, I said that I used to think myself new to the prison, but not new to the planet. That's a saying that goes for most things you will come across. A prison's inmate rules aren't one of them. Understanding that you are a fish out of water, a newbie, someone as unaware as a kid on their first day of kindergarten. You know nothing, and the better you understand it, the more chance you will have of avoiding getting into a confrontation. Until you learn the rules both sides live by, you will be a liability. So make asking about them one of your first priorities. I could literally go on forever with this chapter, but the truth is, there are some things that you will need to discover for yourself. If and when you do, I can almost guarantee that you will become a much better officer because of them. Avoid walking around and pretending like you know everything, like I've seen new recruits do time and again, and just accept the fact that you don't. Seriously, the only one you're kidding by pretending is you. Chapter 13. Have you ever watched a movie about military life where solid friendships formed during some sort of recruit school setting, and for the people to end up lifelong friends because of it? Full Metal Jacket comes to mind, an 80s classic, and one of my favorites. That is how I found my own intake group during my induction training. While it may not have been anywhere near as intense, the shit you will go through is comparable to that level of training. Building relationships is a huge part of working inside a prison. You will meet people with whom you end up sharing some of the most horrendous experiences of your life. There will be times when none of you will think you can possibly make it out, and yet you do. Each and every shift is different, yes, but not so the people standing beside you. One thing you will learn to look for early on is the ones you know you can rely on. I covered this in a previous chapter, but it's worth mentioning again. Not everyone wearing an officer's uniform will have your best interests at heart. Not everyone in an officer's uniform will back you up when the shit really hits the fan. Something you will learn to recognize over time is the people who do have your back, the ones who will stand their ground right beside you when things go down. There will be two types of people with whom you will build relationships, and both will help you survive this place. The first kind is the one wearing the same or similar uniform to you, the people working the same job and having the same end game. These are the ones whose names you seek out on the roster when finding your own name, the ones you happily spend hours next to talking crap about anything and everything. There were some days when the actual work barely registered, as me and the ones assigned to the same unit got on well enough to forget about the work entirely. Sure, we still did what we had to and kept a lookout for any issues, but the conversation flowed so well that we could have been in one of our backyards chilling with a beer. You just gel, if that makes sense. And the faces from your course are the ones you instantly recognize, the ones you immediately gravitate toward without needing some sort of refresher introduction. The other relationships you will build come simply from working with the same people over and over again. You get to learn their style, their moods, their tolerance level, and their resilience. You see what makes them tick and what ticks them off. Some unit allocations can last for years, so you may find yourself spending more time with a colleague than you do with your own family. It's only logical that relationships will form during the course of your work. Something I did notice is just how many romantic relationships form inside prison, and not always with single people. I've seen plenty of marriages fall apart, and the officers end up with someone they work with on the inside. Personally, I put it down to the simple fact that others working the same job probably understand you better, having a much clearer understanding of the types of things you go through. That's not always the case, of course, but it does happen. Relationships aren't always the romantic kind, or lifelong friends for that matter. There will be others, like the kind I have with Tony Malone. It's a form of relationship I understand only too well, and there is very little love lost between us. And then there are those with whom we work and get on well with, but end the moment we go home at the end of the shift. These were perhaps the most common relationships I had throughout my career, and also some of the strongest, believe it or not. Sometimes it's not about forming friendships or looking for someone to cuddle at night. Sometimes it's just about the work itself and going through it with someone who takes it as seriously as you do. Officer relationships aren't the only ones you will build. There will come times when you will also build relationships with inmates. No, I'm not talking about friendships here, or romantic ones, although some will. What I'm talking about are the professional relationships, the understanding relationships, where you know a specific inmate better than most. For me, I think I only ever truly had one of those, a single inmate who I spoke with just a little differently than the rest. I met Luke Dunning back when I worked in admissions. We'd just lost a couple of our billets for stealing shit, their cells tipped during an unscheduled unit search. It's bound to happen when you have a couple of blokes left alone with all manner of contraband. Anyway, Dunning came in as the replacement billet and immediately impressed everyone with his work ethic. The guy didn't need any motivation from us. He simply turned up, did his job, and went back to his unit at the end of the shift. And the work he did couldn't be faulted. All of the uniforms used to be laundered and folded and returned to the shelves for us to hand out to incoming prisoners. He mopped the floors, took care of the bins, and cleaned out the cells. I mean, this guy did what he was supposed to without question. For us officers, it felt like a breath of fresh air after what we had been dealing with the previous few months. Some days, hardly anything happened, with our own workload just a fraction compared to other shifts. It was during those hours of downtime that I came to learn the story of how he ended up inside, and for me, it sent me further along the path to writing Brothers in Crime. While the original inspiration came from a young man who looked far too young to be in this kind of place, it was Luke Dunning who reminded me that not everybody deserved to be inside. Sometimes, circumstances dictated a man's fate, and in his case, I think fate fucked him over. Luke Dunning had been sentenced to 10 years in jail for the manslaughter of another man. That man happened to be his sister's boyfriend who, after a drug-fueled weekend, had beaten the shit out of his girlfriend and caused the miscarriage of her baby. He was lucky he didn't kill her, although luck was something definitely not on his side. I watched Luke tell me the story, the way he tensed up and nearly lost grip of his own emotions when he shared the part about the beating. He'd taken to the guy with a snapped-off broom handle, beating him until part of his brains leaked out from a split in his skull. I watched his lip quiver with emotion as he explained grabbing the man and loading him into the back of his car before taking him to the hospital. There isn't a doubt in my mind that Luke Dunning never meant to kill that man. That love for his sister, that protective instinct he had for her, it got away from him, and what remained was pure rage. He beat him hard enough to split the man's skull and then tried to fix things by getting him medical attention. You decide whether Luke Dunning should have been imprisoned. Perhaps he should have been. What I do know is that he took his punishment like a man. He didn't run. He didn't try to hide the crime. He never once tried to make out like he'd been somehow cheated. He saw himself as guilty and didn't complain once about being where he was. Luke Dunning is probably the closest I ever came to a friend on the other side. The only thing he ever got from me was our fisherman's friend, the classic throat lozenge with an extra kick. What I appreciated most about him was that for those brief moments, we interacted as if neither of us wore a uniform, like two blokes out in the real world and just shooting the shit over a couple of beers. You might have your own story about an inmate interaction in time to come, and only then will you understand what I mean when I say that not all of them look the same. Sometimes one of them might cross your path and just surprise you and prove that the advice to see them as all being the same is wrong. Luke eventually transferred to another prison, and for a time, we went without a billet. By the time the next came along, I myself had already moved on to a different unit to face a new set of challenges. Nothing stays the same for long inside, but those brief interactions will remain with me forever. Chapter 14. While I've shared a lot of doom and gloom in this book, and throughout the series for that matter, it's not always so bad. There will be days where you will struggle to keep a straight face thanks to some of the people you work with. Your colleagues have a way of either making or breaking your day at times. Sometimes, however, you're actually so thankful for them turning up that day that you begin looking for their names on the roster. I've met some pretty decent guys and gals in my time, and I remember some shifts where I doubt I would have made it through without those people by my side. It is to them that I want to dedicate this series, and to all the correctional officers who've put on the uniform at some point in their lives with the hope of helping save society from evildoers. This job is tough, make no mistakes about it. There will be days when you question why you would ever risk your life the way we do. Back when I wrote Screwed Up, I mentioned in the final chapter about the 3 officers I had worked with who had all passed away within just a couple of months of each other. It is with an extremely heavy heart that I update those 3 to 8. 8 souls who I worked with. 8 souls who passed within the space of a year. 4 of them inside of a month. If I can give you one final piece of advice through this series, one last request before we both move on to other things, it's this. It is okay to not be okay. If you need help, then please ask. Reach out to one of your colleagues, and if you feel you can't speak to them, then send me a message. I promise I will drop everything and talk with you, either through Messenger, Zoom, or just email. I don't mind. Too many families break apart because of this job, and if I can help save just a single one, then this entire series will have been worth it. Hell, you don't even need to be in the job. Reach out if you feel you need someone to chat with. There's no judgment here. None. I promise. Writing this series has been an incredible journey for me and has taken me places I never dreamed possible. I'm forever grateful to have made it out of maximum security and able to bring these books to you. I've received so many emails and messages of support from across the world, and to each and every one of you, I say thank you. You've also been begging me not to stop writing these prison books, but the truth is, I don't have anything more to give. Well, maybe there might be something new on the horizon, and it's something I'm going to leave in your court. I've been thinking about writing a couple of extra books called Prison Days Legends, books focusing on the prisons themselves. What I'm thinking is writing books about notorious prisons from around the world and telling them in my own unique style. On top of the list is a prison not far from the one I worked in, one that immediately conjures up horrific images for those who know about it. Pentridge Prison has one hell of a history, including names like Ned Kelly and Mark Brandon Chopper Reed. Is this what you would like me to write? You can send me a message telling me whether you want it or not. For now, however, it's time for me to call it a night on this part of the series. If my numbers are right, then this marks book number 20, if we count each of them individually. Not a bad number to end on. Thank you from the bottom of my heart for continuing to support my work. You are what makes this possible, and for that, I can never truly repay you. Simon, October 5th, 2023. This is Todd Waites. We hope you've enjoyed our production of Prison Days, Recruitment, written by Simon King, narrated by Todd Waites, a Twin Tales Publishing production. Copyright 2023 by Simon King. Production copyright 2023 by Simon King.